has, to an extent, funnelled people towards the beaches of Calais, hasn't it?
Indeed, and I think MPs like Damien Green and others in Kent have been very concerned about the fact that their constituencies have had the brunt of people staying in hotels while their cases are decided. But every so often, something happens like this, and like it did last November, which just puts into perspective how dangerous these journeys are and what can happen to the people who put their lives in the hands of these people smugglers in really very cold conditions. And every so often, I think, just brings MPs up short to remember that these tragedies can happen.
Indeed. And I suspect there will be a degree of reflection on what has been happening, just given the numbers that are involved. But this is a live issue, and it is a live issue not just for the people who stay in and around that part of the world. Politically, as an issue, that this has been something that people have been suggesting is something that weighs on their mind. Now, that is not to say that people are opposed to immigration per se, that people are opposed to people applying for asylum in this country. But it does sometimes feel that this has been a part of our national conversation that we've sometimes just skipped over a little bit because it involves some pretty difficult decisions being made by our senior politicians.
And Rishi Sunak has, if anything, made this such a key priority. He set a very high price on succeeding. I mean, he said that he wanted to get the backlog of 150 people in the asylum system got through by the end of next year, which is, you would think, quite close to the general election. That has set himself a very high bar. He talks a lot about stopping the small boats. We heard that from Priti Patel for many years, that she was going to stop the small boats, and she really did try with a number of different tactics, but it was very difficult to make them work and certainly to make them work legally. So many politicians have tried to tackle this, especially since the numbers have gone up so much, certainly in the last couple of years, taking that particular route. I mean, people used to take different routes, but this is a particularly visible route. But whether Rishi Sunak has set himself this huge challenge of cracking down on small boats, which we've heard from MPs, particularly in sort of what's called the red wall areas, say that this is a huge issue for voters and that they'll lose the election if he doesn't succeed. He's really set himself this task, and it will take many months and legislation through both Houses of Parliament to get any real changes there.
Just the latest in terms of the rescue operation that is taking place in the Channel. From the French side of the Channel, I should say, they're reporting that the Customs Coast Guard patrol boat Carmarthen is to be made available to the Dover Coast Guard to reinforce the resources already deployed in the area. But this statement from the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency just gives you an idea of the coordinated efforts that are going on in the Channel this morning. His Majesty's Coast Guard is currently coordinating a search and rescue response to an incident involving a small boat off Kent, working with the Navy, Border Force, Kent Police and other partners. It's not just the military and those who work in the public sector. Clearly, as this statement shows, a fishing vessel in the area, the Maritime Coast Guard Agency say, is also assisting in the rescue. South East Coast Ambulance and Kent Police are working with us, and an air ambulance has been sent. This incident is ongoing. We have no further information. We do have, however, via Lisa Holland, just the detail that we do understand that there have been fatalities in all of this, which is possibly why Suella Braverman has said this on Twitter just a few minutes ago. I'm aware, she says, of a distressing incident in the Channel this morning, and I'm being kept constantly updated while agencies respond and urgently establish the full facts. My heartfelt thoughts are with all of those involved. A statement from the UNHCR. They say they are gravely concerned at reports of an incident involving a small boat carrying an estimated 30 people in the Channel early this morning. We are seeking further information from the UK authorities at that stage, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Details are still emerging, and we have no real specific figures yet, but Sky News understands the number of people on the small boat was between 30 and 50. If we take a quick look at the map, this will show you exactly where we believe it to be unfolding. We'll show it you in a second. Around halfway, basically, between the Kent coast and the coast of France. In terms of the rescue effort itself, we understand that 2 search and rescue helicopters plus a French Navy helicopter, RNLI lifeboats, and a number of other UK and French Navy boats are involved in the rescue. Searches to continue all day, but at this stage, those searching are not looking for the living, given the temperature of the water. Just before we move on there, also worth saying that information that we have from the RNLI suggests that those lifeboats were launched shortly after 3 o'clock this morning. Let's bring in, if we can, the Director General of the Border Force, the former Director General, I should say, of the UK Border Force, Tony Smith. Tony, really appreciate you coming on for us this morning. Just if you can, just tell us what will be going on in terms of coordination to try and do as much as they can. We understand that this is not a search and rescue operation at the moment, though.
Well, absolutely. I think people need to understand first and foremost that the top priority, not just for the Border Force, but for all of the associated agencies, will be to save lives at sea. That's what we've been doing for a long time now. There will have been a number of exercises already. They will know exactly what to do. There will be a command structure in place. And, our authorities, our agencies will be doing everything they possibly can to save lives and to bring people ashore. As you say, we don't know yet the details of this incident. Those will no doubt emerge over time. But rest assured, that will be the top priority of our officers out there right now, will be to try and make people safe and well. That is our first and foremost consideration.
Absolutely, Tony. But in terms, when you talk about operations, joint operations will have been carried out. I mean, ultimately, people will have planned and prepared for exactly this type of eventuality.
Oh, absolutely, yes. And I mean, it's not the first time it's happened, of course. I mean, you mentioned earlier on, the fact that last November, sadly, we lost lives. There was a report written about that. That's available. Harrowing stories of people from far-flung places trying to track down whether or not they had relatives on that boat. A significant number of irregular migrants in the EU trying to get across. It's a very, very difficult scenario. But in terms of the operational response, we are now, I think, well equipped, and we have saved, I think, an awful lot of lives. I think we can only count our blessings that we haven't seen more incidents like this. But we really do need to hammer home the message, I think, through media, not to do this, not to pay smugglers to get into a boat. It's very tempting when you can see the cliffs of Dover from the beaches of Calais sometimes, and it looks very simple, but these are dangerous waterways. And in these conditions, freezing waters, dark, small dinghies that are not fit for purpose, we've really got to discourage people from trying this and not falling into the hands of human smugglers who really don't care about human life. I've dealt with them in my career. They're not interested in that. They're only interested in the money.
And Tony, then speak to me about this particular aspect of the story. I'm sitting here with the wire services open in front of me, and detail is coming in through all the time. So apologies if I sound slightly disjointed. But we're told that the RNLI lifeboats were launched shortly after 3 o'clock this morning, which suggests, of course, that the incident itself took place, just a short while before. People are travelling across the channel at that time. People are crossing the channel at that particular time in the morning, presumably to try and avoid detection. But at that time in the morning, dear God only knows what the temperature is like, both in the air as much as in the water.
Well, exactly. As you know, we have been working with the French. There was a new agreement quite recently, actually, that we would place Border Force officers in France working on operations on the Calais beaches. You've had footage of what that environment is like. They don't want to be detected on the beaches, because if they are, they will be the vessels will be disabled. They'll be stopped from crossing. So there's a game of cat and mouse going on along a very long stretch of French beach there between law enforcement and the smugglers. And so they will, resort to desperate measures. As you say, this will have been dark. It will have been cold. The people would have been frightened, but they would have have been assured by the pilot or by somebody behind this, look, this is easy, don't worry about this, it's not very far, just get in here and everything's going to be okay. And that's what happens. So that's why the messaging is so important to people, that if we can get the message out, please do not engage with human smugglers to get across the English Channel. We have to stop this. We have to stop the boats, because I'm afraid this is highly, highly dangerous. As you say, you can just imagine what it must be like for some of those people that are in that boat in the dark, in those freezing temperatures, when a vessel runs into trouble on the English Channel. We cannot guarantee your safety. We can only do everything in our power to try and save lives, but we cannot guarantee that, because these are really, really difficult conditions and these are dangerous waters. And I'm afraid that message is not played up enough in this whole debate.
No, entirely, Tony. But you yourself will know from working at Border Force that people will continue to go to Calais to seek out these people smugglers and try and get across the Channel if there are no other ways for them to make it to the United Kingdom. I mean, that's just a simple statement of fact, isn't it?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, I was interested. I mean, there's been a lot of debate about safe and legal routes. I was interested to hear the Prime Minister say that they are looking at that. They want to work with the UNHCR. There is a global problem here that, you know, there are about 120 million people, I think, last I saw from UNHCR, who are already displaced around the world. You know, many of them are in camps. Many of the vulnerable people. I think there is an obligation upon on the Western world to take many, many more of them. That needs a fundamental review. It's a bit like climate change. It's a massive global issue. It's really important, though, that we don't conflate two different issues here. There is a big challenge about legal routes, not just into the UK, but I think, you know, right across where we're seeing irregular migration right across the world. That is a huge issue. But I'm afraid safe and legal, putting a processing centre in Calais is not going to fix this, I'm afraid, because that will just attract more and more people into northern France. I'm afraid disappointed applicants will probably still take to the boats anyway. The smugglers will still be operating in that region. That is not the solution. Of course, we need to look at all options about how we can help with the global migration crisis. But I think between two safe third countries, both signatories to the 1951 Conventions on Human Rights and Refugees, both friendly countries, law enforcement agencies working shoulder to shoulder together, we really ought to be able to come to a political accommodation between us, which would stop these boats. And I think that's what the aspiration is. So far, that's been a step too far.
Tony, what is your appraisal of the level of effort that is being put in on the French side of the Channel to stop this happening?
Well, I can only really speak at an operational level. I'm not a politician. You need to get, you need to get ministers and French ministers on here to talk to you about that. But we've done a lot of work over the years. We've got a lot of bilateral agreements with the French. I know, I've met them myself during my career. They don't like smugglers any more than we do. They don't like fraud. They don't like criminality. They want to work with us on border security. There is no doubt in my mind about this. It is a political issue. And of course, you've got to look at if you look through the lens of the French government, the EU government, they've got huge problems of their own on asylum seekers. They're getting 60, 70% increases at the external EU frontier. I'm glad we're talking to the Calais group about this now. I'm glad that our ministers are speaking at senior levels about this, about how we actually manage migrants across the EU and beyond, because it's a massive problem. So I don't think that at operational level there is any hesitancy at all between us and the French police working together, but we only all have our own respective powers, authorities, and mandates. There's only so much we're able to do under the mandates that we're given. So it really does demand an increased effort and an ongoing effort of dialogue between ourselves and the EU. I've advocated joint patrols before. There's things we can do under international law in the contiguous. There's all kinds of things that we could do with international agreement with the EU that we haven't done, which would simply say, look, you can't come across by this route. And if you do, you'll just go straight back to France. But you can understand from their point of view, they've got very large numbers of migrants coming up through the Schengen zone themselves. And actually, this is a shared problem, not a French problem. So it is hugely complicated at political level. But it's so sad that it takes events like this to bring this message home about what a dangerous business this is, what an awful business this is. I really hope we can, come at some point to an accommodation which actually stops this altogether.
Tony, many thanks for your time this morning. I really, really do appreciate it. And as we edge towards 10 o'clock, Amanda Cass, one of our political correspondents here at Westminster, has been speaking to a source who confirms that there have been definite fatalities in the Channel. A migrant boat with over 40 people on board have capsized. The search will continue all day, but given the water temperature, she is told further rescues are unlikely. It is 10 o'clock. And we're reporting on that breaking news emerging from the Channel. A major incident has been declared there. The Royal Navy, the French Navy, Coast Guards, lifeboats, search helicopters, all involved. A huge operation. Sky News, however, understands that people have indeed lost their life after a boat carrying more than 40 people is thought to have capsized. Now, let's try and bring you up to date with the latest. Details are still emerging. Certainly no word on any specific numbers yet, but Sky News understands that the number of people on the small boat was between 30 and 50. Searches will continue all day, but at this stage, not looking for the living. We are not looking for the living, given the temperature of the water. Now, this is the point in the Channel where we understand that events have been unfolding, around about halfway between the French coast and the Kent coast. There are a minimum of 2 search and rescue helicopters, perhaps, well, indeed, a French Navy helicopter has been added to that. RNLI lifeboats, other UK and French Navy boats are involved in that rescue. And let's bring in Sky's Lisa Holland, who's been on top of this story for us. Lisa, just as much information as you can give us about what has been happening, details coming through in spits and spats at the moment.
Yes, and I mean, to be honest, in the words of one source down on the south coast that I spoke to this morning, he said to me, "It's a big boat." So we have subsequently discovered that we understand that there could be around about 40 people on board. I mean, just to give you a sense, that people who were crossing the Channel last night, trying to get from France to Kent, although conditions are said to be calm on the Channel, of course, it would have been perilously cold. And I understand that really the guesstimate is that the actual air temperature would have felt like about -4, which would probably put the kind of survival rate, if you're in the water, at about 15 to 20 minutes. And that's if you had clothes on, and even if you had some kind of life jacket. Now, the suggestion is that this boat capsized and that there were people in the water. We haven't had precise details confirmed yet, but this is something that I've been told, and that it happened at about 45 miles off Dungeness Point. There were lifeboats which were sent from Dover, Dungeness, Ramsgate, Hastings, also Navy Border Force vessels. There appears to have been some kind of transfer to the William Harvey Hospital in Ashford in Kent. Now, whether that is survivors who were picked up or people for whom it was simply too late is unclear at the moment. But clearly, anybody crossing the Channel last night, the odds would have been very much against them if a vessel got into water, really quite a distance from either the English coastline or the French coastline, the worst possible scenario. But, you know, these vessels have continued, and even the winter months and the sheer cold is not deterring people.
It certainly isn't, but I suppose the point to be made on that, Lisa, is it hasn't been deterring people for an awfully long time. This is not our first winter seeing people lose their lives in the Channel.
No, it's not. And you know, actually yesterday I went to meet an Albanian man who I've been in touch with. I went down to see him in the south of England to talk about the government's announcements yesterday to try to deter Albanians from crossing the Channel. We know that the number of Albanians crossing the Channel has massively increased this year. And talking to him, obviously this incident hadn't happened then, but talking to him about political deterrence, let alone something like this, He said to me, look, people will still keep coming. People never think that this kind of thing is going to happen to them. And when thousands do successfully make it across the channel, obviously they don't think that they're going to be the ones who are going to lose their lives. They talk about what a dangerous journey it is. They know that. They talk about what a frightening experience it is as well to be in the hands of people smugglers and told to meet at whatever point to get on a boat. And then sometimes they look and they see boats that are absolutely bulging with migrants trying to come across the channel. They know it's a risky business, but the end game for them to reach the UK in their minds is worth it. And this will absolutely send shockwaves amongst the asylum seeker community, the migrant community. But I just don't think it will stop people from coming. In fact, after the incident, when around 30 people lost their lives last November, I remember being in touch with an asylum seeker who was actually at a hotel in Liverpool. And it's deja vu, really, because at that time, a year ago, he was saying to me, look, people are really, really shocked, but it's not going to stop people coming. And it didn't, and it hasn't. But yeah, no question. It's also going to open up once more this very big debate amongst the asylum-seeking community that if people are to be deterred from making this kind of journey, it's not just the smugglers, of course, that the smuggling network, which the government's pledged to crack, that needs to be examined. It's also the alternative for people, because there are not, frankly, that many safe and legal routes. And until that changes, I don't think that you're going to stop people from trying to make this crossing.
Lisa, we will back to you if you hear any more, but for now, thanks very much indeed. Just want to take viewers through some of the detail of what is happening right now in terms of the coordination. Here's a statement from, I think it is the Maritime Agency. The Maritime and Coast Guard Agency. HM Coast Guard, His Majesty's Coast Guard, is currently coordinating a search and rescue response to an incident involving a small boat off Kent, working with the Navy, Border Force, Kent Police and other partners. Fishing vessel in the area is also assisting in the rescue. South East Coast Ambulance, Kent Police are working with us, and an air ambulance has been sent. The incident is ongoing and we have no further information. That statement, in fact, released a significant time ago now. As we understand it from our sources, this is not a search and rescue operation any longer. We have, however, been hearing from the Home Secretary, of course, Suella Braverman. This is what she is saying, perhaps aware of those reports of fatalities. I am aware of a distressing incident in the Channel this morning, and I'm being kept constantly updated while agencies respond and urgently establish the full facts. My heartfelt thoughts are with all those involved. Her opposite number, the Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, said this: awful, distressing reports from the Channel this morning, thinking of all those involved. Thank you to the agency and rescue service teams who are responding to this immensely difficult situation. Let's speak now to Amnesty International's Refugee and Migrant Rights Programme Director, Steve Valdez. Steve, good to see you this morning. And look, I will confess that I'm getting pretty sick of having to report on this particular story. This has happened a number of times. It is not me taking a political position to say, that people should not be dying in numbers in the Channel. In your mind, what is responsible for the incredible numbers that have been making this journey this year, and those losing their lives as well?
Well, we all have to remember that the number of people who come to our country, the UK, seeking asylum, remains relatively few compared to elsewhere. Those who do often have family and connections here, or have been unable to get safely into an asylum system elsewhere. And if you look at the situation of people in northern France, it is not hard to understand why people who are facing a thoroughly miserable, dreadful winter, homeless, often having their tents ripped apart and removed by the French police, bullied, menaced, want to make a journey in the hope that this will finally bring them to safety. Mm-hmm. Unless the governments of France and the UK will take responsibility to ensure everybody can get safely into a system to determine who is entitled to stay and who is not, including on this side of the channel with this country taking responsibility, I'm afraid smugglers will continue to govern all of this, and we will continue seeing these dreadful tragedies and people losing their lives.
I'm afraid I think you have a point there. I suspect, though, that the issue for many people is they cannot get to the United Kingdom by any other means than crossing the Channel. It is fine if you're Ukrainian, can get out of the country if you're from Hong Kong, but even Afghans who would qualify for asylum in this country are finding it difficult to get here. So, how do we stop people getting as far as they do, getting themselves to the beaches and into the contact of those people smugglers, and how then do we process genuine, legitimate asylum claims? Is there another way to do this, Steve?
There's completely another way to do this. I mean, the starting point is the last thing that you mentioned. People who make claims should have their claims dealt with. And this country, the UK, has not been doing that for the last few years. It's why a backlog has ballooned from around 10,000, 15,000 people to around 100,000 people in just the space of a few years. So we have to make our asylum system work, and that's by deciding the claims of people. In terms of addressing these dangerous journeys, look, the UK needs to work with others. That's certainly true, but it needs to work with others on getting people safely into asylum systems, not working with others simply to try and stop people moving and leave them in misery. I'm afraid it's not just the UK that behaves like that, but we certainly do as a country and have done for a long time. And we are encouraging nothing that enables people to stop making dangerous journeys and everything to require them to make more journeys, rely more on smugglers. Because if none of us will share responsibility with each other, ultimately, the only people who offer any sort of hope, miserable and exploitative though it is, are those smugglers.
Steve, I'm afraid we have to leave it there, but I suspect we will be talking again very soon. Steve Valdez-Simmons from Amnesty International's Refugee and Migrants' Rights Programme. Thank you very much indeed. Just a bit of detail, in fact, a statement, in fact, I'm reading from Enver Solomon, the Chief Executive of the Refugee Council, that I think is worth bringing in at this point. He says this: we are devastated to hear news of the incident in the Channel today and heartbroken at the reports of fatalities. Our thoughts are with all those affected, and we pay tribute to the rescue teams working on such a dreadful incident. Sadly, this is not the first time we are waking up to such devastating news of people having lost their lives on a harrowing journey to Britain in search of safety. Enver makes this point, Enver from the Refugee Council: it is just over a year since 32 lives were lost in a similar incident. Like those involved in today's incident, they had hopes and dreams for the future. They weren't illegal. They were desperately seeking safety. The Refugee Council saying they will be monitoring the situation carefully, and in the meantime, thank all those who've expressed their sympathy and solidarity with those affected by this horrendous incident. Let's once again bring in our political correspondent, Tamara Cohen. And Tamara, you're getting some update as to the detail of what has happened in the Channel.
Yes, government sources saying that a number of people have been rescued alive. So that is very good news.
Very good news.
That all the Coast Guard and all the emergency services deployed there in the early hours this morning were able to get some people out alive. One source is saying it's as many as 43 rescued alive, but we do not know how many people were initially on the boat, so that is yet to be clarified, but sounds like at least some of those on the boat have been rescued and taken to safety. But sadly, we are also hearing from a number of sources, including MPs in the area, that others are feared dead. But it sounds like not everyone on the boat is in the channel. Some of them have been taken to safety, so that is good news.
Look, there are a number of Conservative MPs who work in this area that we have been hearing from this morning. We've also heard, of course, from Natalie Elphicke, the Dover MP, Damien Green, actually sitting on the sofa just a little bit earlier on today. Do you detect... I mean, look, let's just reiterate that point just now, that at least one source suggesting to us that there have been a significant number of rescues. Great news if that proves to be true. But do you detect anything in this, given, you know, as the Refugee Council pointed out, we were here a year ago, almost to the day. You know, do you detect anything in this incident that will prompt immediate reflection from the government, given we did have a fairly significant announcement on immigration from the Prime Minister yesterday?
We did, and it was almost to preempt a tragedy like this happening. I mean, ever since Boris Johnson was elected and the numbers of people crossing the Channel in particular rose so much, from something under 300 in 2018, 8,500 in 2020, and then 40,000 this year. I mean, we're talking about a real spike in people taking this particular route. The government have been saying we're going to crack down on it under 2 different Home Secretaries. They've tried all sorts of tactics. All of last year they were talking about pushing boats back and all these controversial tactics which in the end could not be used. They found it very difficult to stop people using these routes, and Rishi Sunak is, as a result of his announcement yesterday, able to say that not only has the Home Secretary managed to agree a deal with the French last month when she went over there, offered more money from our side, having British personnel in French control rooms to see how it all works, how they're disrupting the boats before they leave. But yesterday he talked about giving the National Crime Agency more money to tackle the gangs and legislation next year to make it more difficult for people who make it here to get their asylum claims approved. So all this is talking about acting as a deterrent, but it's all going to take many months. And when you get an absolute tragedy like this, the idea that people would risk their lives in sub-zero temperatures to cross the Channel, it really does make politicians reflect on, you know, the conditions that would make people do that. And I think many charities will be today pressing the case, as they often do, that there are not enough safe routes. There are safe routes for people who come from Ukraine on the particular scheme from Afghanistan and from Hong Kong, but for many people in unstable parts of the world, whether that's people coming from Syria, people who've not been able to make their claim in the country that they want to come from Iran, from other places where they say they are suffering from persecution, it is very difficult to get here by any other route. But I think the government will fall back on what they announced yesterday, saying that the Prime Minister has made this his personal priority. But his Home Secretary said a few weeks ago, none of this is the silver bullet, none of this is going to stop it happening. We can just try and do things around the edges, particularly in getting through the enormous backlog of people who've made claims.
Adam Parsons is our Europe correspondent. He joins us on the line, and he is on his way to Calais as we speak. But you have been there, Adam, a number of times in recent months. There's absolutely nothing that is surprising about this incident, is there?
Nothing at all. I mean, frankly, everybody has been expecting something like this to happen. I have to say, honestly, I often think I'm surprised it doesn't happen more often, because so many of these boats leave from the beaches and you see them and they are clearly not seaworthy. They're very often fitted with engines that malfunction. I've seen boats leaving beaches and the engines are sort of spluttering and dying still within sight of them. And they are often overloaded. This boat appears to have had between 40 and 50 people on board it. I can guarantee you that if you had a choice, you would not be getting on a boat of that type with 49 other people. So no, there's nothing surprising about this at all. That the similar incident that happened last year, where 31 people died, was probably a culmination of a whole series of fears, as is this one nearly exactly a year later. And frankly, it's hard to think of a more atrocious situation to find yourself in. Charities that we've been in contact with this morning have told us that, one of them said that they were in contact with somebody on the boat, and they had the last conversation they had with them was at 2:53 in the morning. At that point, the Channel is inky black. It would have been very cold. The water, as you've been hearing, would have been freezing. And remember, this is the busiest shipping lane in the world. So it's a terrifying journey to make. And it is, to my mind, remarkable how many of these small boats actually get across the channel without going to this sort of peril. But it's a measure of the desperation and the desire that people have. It's a point that seems obvious but is worth making. Everybody that you see in a migrant camp in Calais and Dunkirk and in those areas is only there for one reason. It's not because they like the northwest French coast. It's because they want to get to Britain, and they are going to try to do so on board a boat. It's not a question at that point of do they fancy it or do they not. They're going to try to get on a boat, and they're going to try and get across the channel. It used to be that at this time of the year, this sort of cross-channel migration on small boats sort of faded away. And when I say used to be, we're only talking about a relatively short space of time. But this year, and in fact last year, we've seen a change, and it's almost becoming a year-round exercise. And of course, it's incredibly perilous to be doing that journey in this weather. But also the conditions, if you exclude the freezing temperature, yesterday it seems as if conditions were good for taking a boat across. The people smugglers, they don't really think about the temperature. They're looking at the wind, and the wind is a factor here. And the wind, if it's calm, seems to have been in their favour. I have to tell you that I mean, if this number is confirmed, that 43 people have been rescued, that would seem to be a really very, very high number. The fears among many people were of multiple fatalities. French hospitals have been warned that they would expect the potential for a significant number of fatalities. If this figure correct is 43 rescued, that will be, despite the fact that clearly people may well have died in this, that will be a really sort of pleasingly high number of people to have been taken from an incident of this kind.
Yeah, it will. It certainly will, Adam. But I believe the last time we were talking was when you were on the beaches of Calais, was when there was that announcement of a closer UK-France partnership, of greater information sharing, of British officers being in the control room on the French side. Has that joint cooperation not delivered any benefits just yet? Or can we detect any improvement as a result of that? Or has it just not had enough time to bed in?
I think, it's in its infancy. But B, you do come back to some fundamental questions here, which are that these people are trying to get across, that they are empowered to an extent by people smugglers. And let's remember, the people smugglers are earning a lot of money from this. The people at the top of these criminal enterprises are millionaires, and they are making fortunes from this. And it's a cat and mouse game. So it is not so long ago that a matter of weeks, that we filmed migrants running down the beach into the water and jumping into boats that were just off the shore. Why were they doing that? It's because the French police's standing orders say they can't enter the sea to intercept people. They can't arrest people smugglers who are out at sea. And so this almost sort of taxi service, it used to be we saw migrants running down the beach, carrying boats and collectively throwing them in the water and getting in. Now they've discovered, people smugglers have discovered, it's a lot easier if they bring a boat around and get people to run into the water for them. And it's a good example of how they are adept at circumnavigating the rules that are put in front of them. However criminal, however evil we may portray these people as being, they are often smart at understanding what needs to be done. And as the police move the goalposts in one direction, the smugglers react. So yes, there will be more police. But remember also, the number of people attempting to cross the channel has gone up. So if you increase the number of police who are trying to stop them, you are effectively, in terms of a desperate migrant per police officer, the ratio probably hasn't changed that much.
Adam Parsons, thanks very much indeed. Well, our sources are telling us that 43 people have been rescued alive. There have been at least 3 people losing their lives following this incident, this major incident taking place in the Channel. Let's speak now to Kevin Saunders, former Chief Immigration Officer for the UK Border Force in Calais. Good to see you this morning. Wish it was under different circumstances, of course. What do you make of the detail of the rescue effort that is going on at the moment, the scale of it, the multi-agency approach that is being taken? I mean, dear goodness, there's a fishing boat, there's French Navy, there's UK Navy. It's all coming together. And it would appear, going by the number of people rescued, that it has borne fruit.
Yes, it would. And if they have rescued 43 people, that's a fantastic result. And it shows how well that the UK and France can work together when there's a tragedy like this. So, yeah, it's a great result. It's still tragic that 3 people have died so far. But it's fantastic that 43 have been saved, particularly as the weather's so awful.
Just describe to us what the conditions at this time of year would generally be like. We know we're in the middle of an Arctic storm at the moment, but even without that, I mean, crossing the Channel was perilous. Well, it's perilous at any time of the year, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, crossing the Channel in a small boat like this is absolute sheer madness at any time of the year. But in the winter, with the sea temperature being what it is, and we saw the tragic death at the weekend of those small children.
Kevin, can I just get you to pause just for a second? Because I think if you can see your screen right now, if you can see what I'm seeing, we are looking at the rescue itself. I'm just going to try and move myself just slightly closer to the television so I can actually make it out a bit more. I mean, that is clearly an inflatable craft. It is an inflatable craft that I think, if I'm looking at it correctly here, that is folded up on itself. That looks to me like an awful lot of people balancing on the edge, and stuck, wedged, almost, in the middle of that boat. I mean, have you seen anything like this?
Never. I've never seen anything like that at all. It would seem that perhaps the boat didn't capsize, but actually got a puncture in it, because these things are filled with air. So it looks from that picture as though some of the air cylinders have punctured, and the boat started to fold in on itself. It must be incredibly frightening for the people on board, because they don't all seem to be wearing life jackets either.
But again, just taking, and this is very much the first look that I've had at this picture, same as yourself. You look at the individual that is sitting atop the edge of the boat, and almost in the centre of the frame, at the very, very top there.
Yes,
wearing a short-sleeved shirt, presumably in the wee hours of the morning whilst crossing the Channel. I mean, you'll have seen that, I suspect, more than once.
Yes, I mean, that's just sheer and utter madness. Short-sleeved shirt in this weather, coming across the Channel, he's going to be soaking wet. It's just absolute and utter madness. It really is.
What is your view then as to where we should be targeting our resources to prevent this? Now, as we said, we understand that 43 people have been rescued alive, which is fantastic. But 3 people have died. We're now looking at one of in fact, it's the lifeboat from the Dungeness station. I can just make out there, and that's them recovering the boat proper. I think maybe one person perhaps still inside it. Where do we need to be focusing our resources? Do we need to be stopping people getting to the beaches of Calais? Do we need to be targeting the people smugglers themselves? Where is the solution to this?
It's both. We've got to target the people smugglers, and the extra money for the NCA that the Prime Minister announced yesterday will be very helpful. But we've also got to stop people getting onto the Channel and risking life and limb. Because not only are they risking not only are they risking their lives, the rescuers are risking their lives as well.
And we are going to see this again, aren't we? Unless some pretty significant action is taken immediately, Kevin. Is that fair to say?
That's fair. I mean, last year, I was in Dover last year when the disaster happened last year, and I said then, this will happen again. And unfortunately, it has. We have to stop the people coming from the beaches. We just have to do it. and if we have to throw more money at it, so be it. But we can't have people risking their lives like this. It's just immoral, basically.
It certainly is, and one incident that we have been reminded of this morning by the Refugee Council, no less, is the one that took place, roughly the same time last year, in which more than 30 people lost their lives, and that wasn't enough for there to be changes to ensure that it didn't happen again.
No, it didn't, and it's very sad that it didn't. The trouble is that the French interpretation of the law of the sea is different from ours. So I don't blame the French. They can only operate within what they see as the law. So they can't intercept the people on the channel, although that's what would stop it if they could. So it's got to be more people on the beaches. The government are doing things like putting people into the French control headquarters at Cap Grenade. So that's a positive move. The moves that the Prime Minister announced yesterday, again, they're helpful. They're not the silver bullet, but they are helpful. If we get something on Rwanda, that will be helpful. They're small steps, but a lot of small steps might just work out.
Kevin Saunders, many thanks indeed. And as you look at the picture there, Suella Braverman quotes at the bottom of the screen. We will be hearing from the Home Secretary in a statement to the House of Commons at around about 12:30. My colleague Jane Secker is in the studio.
Neil, thanks very much. If you're just joining us, we can bring you the news that Sky News understands that the number of people that have been recovered on this small boat, between 30 and 50 when it went down in the Channel. Searches will continue all day. But at this stage, sources say 43 people were rescued from the boat. 3 people are known to have died. It is feared, of course, that more could have perished. The incident happened, and these are images of it, around halfway between the Kent coast and the coast of France. 2 search and rescue helicopters plus a French Navy helicopter, R&O lifeboats and other UK and French Navy boats have all been involved in that rescue. Joining me now, Sky correspondent Tamara Cohen. Tamara, what more can you tell us?
So what we're hearing is that while it sounds clear that there have been some fatalities, we're hearing at least 3 fatalities from this awful incident. It sounds as if a significant number of people may have been rescued, even in those freezing conditions. If we just look at that picture, I mean, and we were hearing from the former Border Force Chief Kevin Saunders that he's not seen anything like this before. It doesn't look as if the boat has necessarily capsized. It's kind of fallen in on itself, as if maybe he said it had a puncture. So we're yet to get to the bottom of what actually happened to this boat, because although it was absolutely freezing last night, the conditions were said to be calm. So they obviously set sail thinking they had a chance of making it to the UK. So it sounds as if a significant number of people have thankfully been rescued and taken to safety. But some people in those freezing conditions last night appear to have died. This is a tragedy, the worst tragedy that's happened in the Channel since last November, when we know that 30 people lost their lives when a boat capsized, and we've heard since about the frantic calls made to emergency services. It sounds as if the emergency services were on the scene very quickly in the early hours of this morning, but is again going to put a focus on this small boats issue and the really dramatic increase in the number of people taking this route.
And Amanda Acas also joins us on the studio. Amanda, this is an area you know well that you've reported from. What do you think the reaction will be locally? Clearly, a lot of local people have been involved in this rescue.
Well, absolutely. You just look at the number of people who volunteer for the lifeboats, getting called out in the middle of the night in these freezing conditions, going out there in the dark, searching for what could well be many bodies in the water. It sounds, as you were saying, Tamara, that indeed they managed to get to the scene incredibly quickly in order to pick people up. You can see there in the pictures that people aren't wearing proper waterproof warm clothing, many of them not wearing life jackets. Indeed, I've covered covered a number of cases in the past where only the smugglers were wearing jackets, and you could have 20 or 30, 40 people crammed onto these tiny boats, which often are only designed for, say, 12 people to be on board, and clinging on. And if there are any problems with the boats, which clearly are massively overloaded, sometimes it's just that the engine fails and then they get swamped by the waves, or there could be a puncture, or there could be another problem with the boat. Obviously, it is the world's busiest shipping lane as well. So quite often these huge cargo ships, the ferries going backwards and forwards, don't see these tiny boats in the channel. They can get swamped by their waves as well. But it does indeed seem that they were within British waters, and when they got into difficulty were able to alert the authorities, who seem to have mounted a very efficient rescue operation getting onto the scene, although of course, as we understand, that there have been at least 3 people who have died. I know in the past there were awful incidents where people have been swept overboard as well, which is something that can sometimes happen, because obviously when you are going into the sea like that in the middle of the night, in the dark, in freezing conditions, you really are at the mercy of the conditions out there. I think, as you mentioned, the incident last year, which really, I think, was a huge shock for all local communities who've been used to seeing many, many more of these boats arriving on the beaches, or people being brought ashore by the lifeboats and border force cutters at Dover. We see all those photographs of people coming on shore, being looked after, and I think that incident last year really reminded people what the risks are. And once again, now we're in the winter. Previously, when this first started happening, we only saw boats doing that crossing in the summer months when it was very calm, good conditions. Now, clearly, people are trying to do the journey all year round, and you can see how very dangerous that is at this time of year.
Let's bring in now Claire Mosley from the Care for Calais charity, which is a refugee charity working with refugees in the UK and France. And Claire, what will the last few days have been like for these people who are on this boat? What are the steps that they go through before they embark on this journey?
Well, very sadly, they probably would have been full of hope. They hope that they are coming to the UK to start a new life. That the people who have come from the very worst things in the world, from war zones, from places where they have been persecuted and tortured, and they believe that they're coming to the UK to finally reach safety. It's unbelievably tragic that right on the cusp of being able to achieve safety and start a new life, that they could die right at the very end of their journey. It's unbelievably tragic. And it's really horrible for us to think just 3 weeks ago, we were in London for the vigil with the families of those people who died just a year ago, seeing their unbelievable grief that hasn't diminished in the slightest, hearing how they spoke about their family members who drowned a year ago. I don't have the words to convey to you just how awful that was, seeing their pain, seeing how raw it still is, feeling their loss. And now knowing that there's going to be at least 3 more families now going through that same pain and grief, the same questions, the same despair, the same heartache, same questions. I can't bear to think that there's now going to be another 3 families and extended families in that same state of upset and loss.
And Claire, you know, as you say, we are just a year on from that dreadful loss of life in the Channel. And what is clear is that has not deterred people from making this journey, and it's not deterred them from making it in the most appalling conditions.
It's not, and it's not going to. I mean, that is the whole point about refugees, isn't it? The things that they are coming from are so very awful. The journeys that they've made are so horrendous and so harrowing. The risks that they've had to take to get this far are so massive that by the time they get here, that journey is just one more risk. It's one more risk that they take to justify, if you like, to fulfill the risks that they've already taken. They're in a state of mind that is so desperate. They're so at the end of their tether that they've already overcome so much that it is just one more risk. That is what it's like to be a refugee. Being a refugee is an awful existence. It means that terrible, terrible things have happened to you It means that you are on the cusp of reaching safety. There could not be people that need our help more than refugees. They are people who have seen their families killed in conflicts. They're people who have suffered extreme torture. They're people who might have been persecuted for years. There really are nobody in the world that needs our help more than refugees. The statistics that the government recently released show that the nationalities of the people that we're working with in Calais, 80 and 90% of them are having their asylum claims accepted when they reach the UK because of the terrible things that they have suffered. You know, the facts and the data and everything that I experience will tell you that these are people who have suffered absolutely horrendous things. There cannot be people who need our help more. And it's really devastating to know that a year on from that terrible tragedy that happened when 32 people lost their lives, our government has taken no steps whatsoever to help these people. You know, it would be so easy for us to reach out and help them in Calais. There are things that can be done. And instead, all the policies that our government is looking at, all the things that were talked about yesterday, are simply things that are targeted at keeping them out, at making sure that we do not have any responsibility for them, that we don't take any steps to help them when it would be so easy for us to do so. You know, we could offer safe passage to people in Calais in the same way that we did with Ukrainians. If we gave them safe passage across the channel, nobody would need to risk their lives. And we did it for Ukrainians. So there's no reason that we can't do it for other refugees. And at a swoop, that would put the people smugglers out of business. That would mean that nobody is risking their lives. This is all so completely unnecessary. It doesn't need to happen. Nobody needs to risk their lives. And as I say, we have all this data to show that they are genuine refugees in real need of our help. And there couldn't be anybody that we need to help more than these people. So why can't we just offer them safe passage? We did it for Ukrainians. The system is there. It's in place. We know it works. We know that no Ukrainians got on small boats. We know that no Ukrainians paid people smugglers. So, you know, we have it right in front of us. And a year on, after seeing 32 people lose their lives, nobody is willing to consider it and nobody is willing to discuss it. And I find that very hard to take. And now it's happened again. We knew it would happen again, and now it has.
OK, Claire Mosley from Care for Calais charity, thank you very much for joining us. If you are just joining us, these are the latest images that we have of this rescue. We know that the RNLI and also the Royal Navy and Border Force vessels were involved in the rescue of this boat. Initially described as a small boat, but then it became clear that it was a larger vessel, but we can see the images of it and it isn't that big at all. It is an inflatable craft. Mercifully, 43 people were rescued alive from it. 3 are known to have perished, feared that it could be many more. But when we see the size of the boat, it is astonishing that 43 people were able to survive that. In terms of the wider picture, the numbers of people coming across the channel over the last year, the latest figures show that up until yesterday, 44,711 had crossed the channel on board small boats this year. They travelled in on just over 1,000 boats, 1,087 boats, an average of 41 people per vessel. It is a huge increase on last year when there were just 28,526 arrivals over the whole 12-month period. Well, the Home Secretary is going to make a statement to the House of Commons at 12:30. We're joined now by the Conservative MP for Dover and Deal. That is an area, of course, enormously affected by this, Natalie Elphicke. And Natalie, what are your thoughts today?
Well, I'm very, very saddened to hear of this tragedy in the Channel today. Waking up to the news that I fear, as the MP for Dover and Deal, day after day, lives lost, a number saved only, 43 saved only due to the bravery and professionalism of the rescue services that operate out of Dover and along our East Kent coast. And I have to, pay tribute to their bravery and thank them for their rescue mission this morning in absolutely treacherous wintry conditions.
It must have been a horrific call out at 3 o'clock, mustn't it? In terms of what the solution is, what would you like to see the government do?
Well, as I've said now time and again, it is a matter of great urgency that the boats are stopped entering the water from France. People are safe in France. This is illegal criminality, organised crime through and through. That number of people crossing now very near to 45,000 people. That's the result of industrial illegal immigration by organised criminal gangs operating on the shores of France. It is urgent that the Prime Minister, who is taking personal responsibility for this issue, has a summit with President Macron, and that action is taken to bring this to an end before we have further loss of life in the Channel.
We spoke to Claire Mosley from the Care for Calais charity just a moment ago. She said one way to get the boats to not go in the water in France would be to set up a centre in northern France and offer safe passage to those who believe that they have a strong claim. Would that not be a solution?
Unfortunately, organisations like Care for Calais are part of the problem, not the solution, in dealing with the Channel crossings. Care for Calais is one of the organisations that's taking legal action against the government and is not, I think, really looking out for those solutions that would be in the best interests of people who are in the hands of these criminal gangs and often also in crime here in the UK once they are smuggled in and involved in modern slavery. We've got to, really be clear that those organisations are blocking the attempts of the government to be trying to bring an end to the small boats crossings. It is vital that they really look at the interests of people in the hands of criminal gangs, encourage them not to take these journeys that are so dangerous and do result, unfortunately and sadly, in loss of life. Encourage people instead to ask France for refugee assistance if they are in need of it, or any other country before they reach France, who is party to the same refugee conventions, and also to make it really, really clear that the majority of people who have been travelling by the small boats arriving in Britain in recent weeks are Albanians from a safe country and who are not in need of refuge or asylum. And it's absolutely vital that we take action and bring an end to this and stop these criminal gangs who are ruthless and do not care if they are risking lives in the pursuit of their illegal crime.
Do you dispute the figures that she provided us? We know that there is a particular problem with Albanians travelling across in recent weeks, but the figure that she quoted, 80% of those who reach the UK on these small boats are actually granted asylum.
Well, we know that our system in the UK is in need of reform, and the Prime Minister yesterday set out his 5-point plan for tackling that, which included
I just wanted to press you on that actual figure, though. Is that as far as you understand it, is that a correct representation of the facts, that 80% of those who are come across on the small boats are eventually granted asylum?
Well, we know that once people are in the UK, it is extremely difficult to do anything but for the majority of people to stay in the UK, and that is why it is such a strong magnet for people to come in through illegal routes and try to get to Britain. That's why we have to be very, very clear that illegal immigration is not acceptable, that we do have, but we do, if I can finish, but we do have resettlement schemes that we operate with the United Nations, where we bring people directly from conflict areas. There are over 100 million people displaced around the globe. The right way to deal with refugee and asylum is to make sure that we have the systems and processes and support in place to help people. We do that. As the Prime Minister said yesterday, more humanitarian visas have been issued than since the Second World War. We are a generous country, but this is about illegal, organised crime. And if we want to help people who are in need of assistance, they should not be taking this incredibly dangerous crossing. We've seen lives lost again today. We've got to bring it to an end.
But their point is, of course, that you say that they are illegal, but if 80% of them are granted asylum in the UK, it shows that they had a valid case, which therefore means that they are not illegal. They had a valid case for asylum, and they would argue that because there aren't the safe routes that they're able to use, they've been forced to take this action. The argument of many charities is if the British government had more safe routes, then they wouldn't have to get on the small boats.
There are safe routes of entry. We have issued, as the UK, more humanitarian visas than since the Second World War. There are safe passage routes. There are applications for work visas, which hundreds of thousands of people take. There are education visas. There are family reunion visas that you can apply in the UK from a room and a computer in the UK, so no family member needs to get into a boat or be in the hands of illegal immigration. Illegal entry to the UK is a crime. It is not the way to come to the UK. The UK does have resettlement and asylum programmes. It does give a tremendous amount of support around the globe, as well as to people who settle here in the UK. And it's absolutely vital that those two issues are not confused. To do so just drives up more illegal immigration. We need to tackle this at source and recognise this for the illegal activity that it is. There are safe and legal routes to come to the UK, and people must take those. They must not risk their lives or indeed lose their lives in the wintry sea in the Channel.
Natalie Elphicke, the MP for Dover and Deal. Good to talk to you today. Thank you very much for joining us. Natalie Elphicke there, the MP for that patch most affected, it's fair to say, by these crossings in these boats. And we can see these images of this boat that travelled across the sea last night in really, really cold conditions. Mobilisation of the RNLI and the Border Force and the Royal Navy to rescue the people that were on this boat. 3 people have died, we know. 43 were rescued. Let's bring in our correspondents here in the studio. I'm joined by Sky correspondents Tamara Cohen and Amanda Acast. Tamara, to you first of all. We saw the Prime Minister make this extensive speech yesterday about trying to tackle this very problem, but this will put more pressure on him, won't it?
That's right. And if we were expecting this to be some kind of watershed moment in our policy towards small boats, I don't think that's going to happen. The politics of it are as set out by Natalie Elphicke, the MP for Dover. Many Conservatives think that those charities who work with refugees and are pushing for there to be more safe routes, you say that there aren't the safe routes there for people to apply safely, otherwise that's why they're putting their lives in the hands of these people smugglers and these small boats in freezing conditions. Tory MPs, as you heard there, think that they're part of the problem. And Rishi Sunak set out yesterday what's intended to be a tough approach to say that he wants there to be a number of deterrents in the shape of threats to send people back to certain countries like Albania, threats to send people to Rwanda. And the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, who will be speaking in Parliament on this at lunchtime, is a hardliner. She described the migrant boats arriving on the UK shores as an invasion, very controversially, back at the party conference in September. So, look, I think they'll fall back on what they said yesterday, saying the Prime Minister has taken personal charge and he's very energised about this issue. But everything he suggested yesterday is going to take many months to have any impact. He's talking about legislation to stop the Modern Slavery Act being abused. He's talking about more money from the National Crime Agency so it can tackle the people smuggling gangs. And he did also touch on working with other countries, because, of course, that's the key to this. He met last week the Calais group, France, Germany, Belgium, to talk about what action they can take together. But, you know, many people will say that's the key. You have to work with other countries on this because just taking action here in the UK is, first of all, not that effective, as the Home Secretary admitted herself. It's not a silver bullet, and people will continue to risk their lives as they are in increasing numbers. I mean, we've had record numbers this year, 44,000. It was only about 300 back in 2018. So the measures that he announced yesterday are intended to sound tough, but I think many charities would say that they are the wrong place to be looking.
OK, tomorrow, we're just going to bring you the latest images that we have, and this is actually moving footage that we have of the rescue. This is moving footage, obviously taken from the same angle as the still pictures that we saw earlier. You can see the helicopter there up in the sky trying to illuminate the scene to try and help the situation for those on the lifeboat, on the ground, on the water, pulling those people off that boat. Another bit of breaking news that we can bring you on an unrelated story, and this is about the explosion that happened in Jersey over the weekend. We know that the emergency services there said that they had given up hope of finding any survivors. It was a recovery operation. They have confirmed this morning, excuse me, that one further fatality has been confirmed at that site. That is now 8 people who have died in that blast in Jersey, and the authorities in Jersey believe that one person there is still unaccounted for, one resident that they are still looking for, not expecting to find any survivors, but they have now found the remains of an 8th person in that explosion that rocked this quiet town over the weekend. Well, let's return to the breaking news this morning that there has been a significant boat rescue in the English Channel overnight. Let's bring in Amanda Acas, our correspondent here. And Amanda, this is an area you've reported from extensively in the past. What do you think that the ramifications of this are for those living in that area? Do you think it will change anything? Tamara said that she didn't think it was going to be a particularly watershed moment.
I think, tragically, really, people in that area of Kent and the south coast, in Sussex as well, they've become very used to this, to seeing the boats arriving on the beaches, walking up and down beauty spots, finding the remains of boats where people have arrived and been able to make their own way on into the rest of the country. But more generally, people being rescued by the RNLI, being picked up by those Border Force cutters and being brought into Dover and processed and then and taken on from there while people put in their asylum claims. I think there are many charities, as we've been hearing, who work with people on both sides of the Channel. And I think particularly a key issue here is about the relationship with the French authorities. We often hear from many MPs in Kent that the French should be doing more. There wasn't a particularly enthusiastic welcome for that deal that was announced by Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman a few weeks ago of greater cooperation, greater funding for the French authorities to allow more joint working with UK Border Force officers working alongside their French counterparts. And we heard Mr Sunak yesterday in the Commons talking about the additional patrols on the French beaches. Now, French politicians often point the finger at the UK authorities and say not enough is done here to prevent people working illegally. For example, we don't have identity cards as they do in the continent, and they believe that's a draw factor, and they say, well, actually, the UK authorities need to think quite differently about our approach. That's obviously a row that goes on between politicians of the two nations. I think perhaps one aspect of this that perhaps might become more difficult over time, as we saw when more funding was pumped into protecting the Channel Tunnel and the port, the ferry terminals, building, a lot of money was pumped in, millions and millions, into building new fences and putting up extra security there. And that's partly what stopped people getting onto the lorries and the trains and moved them towards taking this much more dangerous approach in terms of the small boats. There are miles and miles of beaches in quite remote areas in northern France. It is difficult to keep that patrolled all the time. Equally, as we see more and more resources diverted to that, you could potentially see more people trying to make that crossing at night, as we've just seen, and in the kind of conditions where you really doesn't seem like it would be the best time to be attempting this journey in freezing conditions like this.
And Amanda, once these people have been rescued, what will happen to them? We obviously saw there was a lot of publicity a few weeks ago about the Manston Centre, where a lot of people were going. That was eventually emptied. This is another concern for local people, isn't it? That all of a sudden there's a whole load of new people coming into their area. What would be the general pattern that would happen when someone's been rescued on a boat like this?
Yes, absolutely. So they are taken and they are initially assessed, and then that was what Manston was all about, really, carrying out those assessments, because so many people had arrived at the same time. That's why there were these long delays keeping people detained. Then people put their applications in and have to wait, as we know, the backlog, nearly 150,000 50,000 people waiting, nearly 100,000 of those waiting more than 6 months. So people are generally given accommodation, many of them in hotels. We heard a lot yesterday from the government saying that's costing them £5.5 million a day, and that's why they're keen to look at other options, accommodation in military barracks, disused holiday parks, former university accommodation, and so on. That's not simple either, and I think particularly because people are arriving in the southeast, many are accommodated in the southeast. Napier Barracks, for example, was used as a place where people stayed for many years. It had big problems with COVID outbreaks, fires, all kinds of issues with the local community weren't happy about that being there, and I think we're going to see that in other areas where potential military bases and holiday camps are being used. The other issue, of course, is the children, the under-18s, because like any under-18, the local authority has a duty to care for them, to provide them with foster care, or to look after them in de facto children's homes. That is an expensive, complicated thing to do. Kent, over many years, was bearing much of that burden. Now there's a new system where other authorities have to take their share, but I think that has caused other problems as well, because in other parts of the country they're not used to doing that, and that's caused some friction with local communities, worried about the division of resources. So it's not a simple issue, and that's why for the government they've had such pressure from their own MPs to try and find a solution to reduce those numbers, but clearly there are many, many desperate people out there who are continuing to make that journey.
And tomorrow, very briefly, we're expecting a statement from the Home Secretary immediately after Prime Minister's questions.
Yes, we are. We're expecting her to give us an update potentially on what exactly happened and the numbers of people rescued and the numbers of people who we understand have sadly lost their lives. So we'll get more from the Home Secretary, who tweeted this morning that she was being kept in touch with developments to try and work out exactly what had gone on. But the question for her and for Rishi Sunak is there are plenty of Conservative backbenchers who see this in very stark terms. They want to stop boats coming across the Channel, and they look to the current Prime Minister and the last Prime Minister and the one before that, who told them that this was possible, that they could stop boats coming across the Channel, when in fact, there are no real silver bullets. You can take measures to try and tackle it, and you can take measures to try and provide a deterrent. But we had Conservative MPs telling us on camera last night that they think they'll lose the next election if the government does not tackle this small boats issue. That's why Rishi Sunak rushed forward this announcement yesterday, which I understood was intended for the new year. He knew a lot of people are concerned about it. People will be even more concerned now with today's tragedy. But I think the tough approach is what a lot of people in his party want to see. And, many will say cynically that they are the audience for these measures yesterday, the tough-sounding measures, when, of course, a lot of the people who come over here have their asylum claims approved.
OK. Tomorrow, and Amanda, thank you very much. Good morning. If you're just joining us, it is just after 11 o'clock. You are watching Sky News, and we are staying with our breaking news that 3 people have died and at least 43 have been rescued after a major incident in the Channel. A major search and rescue operation is still underway after reports of a boat going down just before 4 o'clock this morning. The operation in the Channel is a joint effort between the Royal Navy, the French Navy, the Coast Guard and the RNLI. Now, the latest pictures that we have of the rescue, that is an RNLI lifeboat, as you can see, the latest moving pictures that we have. Helicopters were involved also helping illuminate the scene and the conditions at that time, 4 o'clock in the morning, on what everybody here knows has been a freezing cold night. Really, really difficult and quite astonishing, really, that 43 people were rescued alive when that boat got into difficulties. Joining me now, Sky correspondents Tamara Cohen and Amanda Acas. Let's start with our political correspondent, Tamara Cohen. And Tamara, we had this massive announcement from the Prime Minister yesterday to try to tackle this problem. Is there anything in what he has said that can be brought in swiftly to try to avert these kind of things happening again?
None of it's going to happen overnight. I mean, what Rishi Sunak was talking about yesterday was essentially deterrence of the more than 40,000 people who have come over the Channel in small boats this year. 13,000 of them, about a third, are Albanian, and the Prime Minister and other MPs have been concerned that that is a safe country. So people should not be making asylum claims as they would from a war-torn country. So he was talking about speeding up agreements to send them back there, although that has been tried by previous Home Secretaries for some time. He's also talked about getting the Rwanda scheme up and running, which is currently tied up in the courts, and no one knows if anyone will ever be taken to Rwanda. So that was one part of it, but he's also responding to concerns about the way that local councils have had to take over hotels in order to put up people who are waiting for their claims to be processed, and the urgent need to both get through that backlog with more staff working on it and to put people up in different accommodation, as Amanda was just saying. But I think what many MPs will be putting their hopes on, especially as we think about the next election, is that legislation coming forward next year to try and clamp down on some of these things. But that is going to take months. It's going to be just potentially amended by people in Parliament. So look, none of it's going to be a silver bullet, but the Prime Minister did announce more funding for the National Crime Agency as well to tackle criminal gangs. So he'll say he's pursuing all the available options, but certainly they are not good. And he has also set himself a very high bar, saying he wants to stop the boats. Stop the boats is something he has often said. And, you know, it's hard to see how, certainly in the short term, that is going to really happen. I mean, if people are willing to take these desperate journeys, the French authorities can't patrol hundreds of miles of coastline, although they've had more money from the UK this year to ramp up what they are doing. But this is going to continue to happen, and it's hard to see how you can set yourself a target of not having anyone crossing those boats when you look at how it has spiked in recent years. I mean, when they started collecting figures on this properly in 2018, there were under 300 people coming that route. People came other routes through lorries and so on. Then it was about 8,500 in 2020, and now it's over 40,000. And yes, other European countries do have more than that, but it's something that has increased dramatically, and it's something the government is really scrambling to respond to.
Responses that we have had already this morning have been from the Home Secretary and the Shadow Home Secretary. The Home Secretary has released this statement. She says, "I am aware of a distressing incident in the Channel this morning, and I'm being kept constantly updated while agencies respond and urgently establish the full facts. My heartfelt thoughts are with all of those involved." The Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, tweeted, "Awful, distressing reports from the Channel this morning. Thinking of all those involved, thank you to all the agency and rescue service teams who are responding to this immensely difficult situation." And Amanda Acas, that is a point that Yvette Cooper makes, isn't it? That this has required a big response, again, in the middle of the night from local services, obviously the Navy involved, Border Force involved, but also the RNLI, staffed by volunteers.
Absolutely, and I think that is, really key part in all of this. If we're having, nearly 45,000 people in the past year making that crossing, for most of those boats end up calling to the emergency services once they're in British waters. It's part of the model, if you like, that many of the people smugglers use. They don't really need to deliver people safely all the way across. Quite often what happens, certainly in many cases that I've covered in the courts, they will make a phone call once they know they're in British waters, and then they know that they can come and be picked up. And that's very difficult because obviously our authorities have a duty to save the lives of people at sea. And for the volunteers of the RNLI, it's obviously extremely distressing. They are being called out on many incidents. As you say, they might be at home, they might be at work on this occasion, and indeed many at night at home with their families, dashing down, being scrambled out there in dangerous situations for them, quite often if it's difficult conditions in the Channel, rough and cold, trying to find people and pull them on board. Often when you see the boats coming in, they get brought. On some occasions I've been down there when there's multiple boats, up to a dozen sort of all coming in at once, and it's very difficult. How do they spread their resources in order to reach everyone? And then you have these lifeboats coming in themselves absolutely packed to the gunnels with people that they've managed to rescue, thankfully. In most cases they miraculously do manage to get to people. But I think what was interesting in the announcement we had yesterday from Rishi Sunak is that there's going to be this new sort of command for the English Channel. They say they're going to employ another 700 people. It's going to bring together civilian and military authorities and kind of free up a border force to focus more on the kind of enforcement activity and so on, in terms of more raids on the gangs and so on, which I don't know what that will necessarily mean for the RNLI, but ultimately they are the first line of this, and they're the ones that, you know, they know the sea, they get to people most quickly, they're right there. I think there's only 1 or 2 cutters that are there, the naval ships. So in terms of the resources, if you're having that many boats, then, you know, it's a lot of people that you need to be able to get onto the channel and scramble to pull, you know, 43 people out of the water.
Yeah, Amanda, thanks very much. Let's bring in our correspondent, Lisa Holland. Lisa, you've spoken to many of those who make these perilous journeys, and really seeing these moving images showing people willing to make this journey in the conditions that it was last night really shows the scale of the problem, doesn't it?
It does, but I mean, I suppose the million-dollar question is, what impact will it have? And, you know, as it happens, Jane, I was talking to an Albanian man yesterday who crossed the channel in a small boat in the summer, and we were talking about the measures that were announced by the government yesterday to try to deter Albanians in particular from crossing the channel. And when I asked him with regard to that political announcement, would that stop Albanians trying to come? And he said, well, frankly, to be honest, no. If people have the will and they have in their mind specifically a final destination, and namely the UK, rather than trying to claim asylum in France, then they will go that extra mile and attempt to cross the channel. It's always worth bearing in mind when you talk about asylum seekers, that so often people ask the question, well, why don't they claim asylum when they reach a safe country? Why don't they claim asylum in France? Why do they undertake this dangerous channel crossing? And often the answer is because they have family or they have a diaspora in the UK that they want to reach. They have relatives in communities. They almost have a kind of community that they want to get to. So that's why they go this extra mile. They know that it's a dangerous crossing. They know that they will be packed onto boats, often without life jackets. They know that right now conditions are really, really cold. And actually just talking to some people down on the south coast, the estimate is that if anyone was in the water, they probably would only have been able to survive for about 15 or 20 minutes. And that in reality, the air temperature that people would have been experiencing was probably about -4. And yes, we know it was very, very cold, but it was also quite calm on the channel last night. And that's the point, is that they look for a window of opportunity for good weather, for a calm crossing, so they can try to limit the risk of being on such a small boat, on such a busy waterway. But will it stop people from coming? No, there will be shock amongst the asylum seeker community, but we know from the disaster last year that people still kept on coming. I think there will be a wider political response from those who campaign within the asylum seeking community, that the debate has to be had about why there are insufficient safe and legal routes. The government keeps saying people should use safe and legal routes, but the statistics show there are really not that many places available via safe and legal routes. So when you talk to people who come from countries such as Iran or Afghanistan, they say that they have little option but to try to go that extra mile and come overland and then try to cross the channel and put themselves in harm's way, as we saw happened overnight last night.
And Lisa, also, I mean, you know, when you think who in their right mind would get on a freezing boat in the dark on an icy night like that when the temperatures are down to -4. But when you think about the number that are coming across, over 40,000, and a small, very small proportion of that very large number actually perish, I guess a lot of people will look at the statistics and think, actually, my odds are pretty good.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Jane. And the other thing which is worth pointing out is that it's such a tried and tested route. You look at this enormous response that we've seen overnight, lifeboat crews from Dover, Dungeness, I believe Ramsgate, Hastings, the UK Navy, Border Force and French vessels as well. that because so many people are crossing, there is this support system, if you like. And I know that asylum seekers have told me in the past that basically they're told that once they get into UK waters, they have the number for the Coast Guard to call, and then they will say, essentially, we're in UK waters, and then it's down to the UK authorities who will go and get them, which has prompted accusations in the past. For example, the RNLI have had to defend themselves against those who describe them as almost like a taxi service at sea. Obviously, the RNLI would say, our job is to save lives at sea, and that's exactly what they have been doing overnight. But the fact that there is this big response shows you just how much focus there is in the Channel right now. And asylum seekers know that. They know that equally, if they do get into trouble, there's a reasonable chance that there will be some kind of rescue vessel who will come to assist them.
Lisa, thanks very much for bringing us that. Let's talk now to Bethany Gardner-Smith, Chief Executive of Safe Passage. Now, that champions the rights of refugees as they flee persecution. Bethany, I don't know if you managed to catch her interview with the local MP, Natalie Elphig, a little earlier. She was talking about charities such as yourselves and Care for Calais, and saying that your charities are part of the problem, not the solution, because you're blocking the attempts of the government when they try to remove people from this country who've come here through these irregular routes. What would you say to that?
Well, I think that's quite irresponsible, actually, in terms of those comments. I mean, what we do as a charity is to work with refugees in northern France at the moment, many of whom are unaccompanied children, to try and find safe alternatives for them, including safe routes to the UK. But actually, the reality, as we just heard from your correspondent, is that there are very few available. And actually, many of the safe routes that refugees were able to access have since been closed down. I'll give you an example. We work with children in northern France, in Calais, all the time. A couple of years ago, those who had family here in the UK, we would be able to work with them to gather evidence to submit a visa application to come and join their family here. And we would be able to put them on the Eurostar, and they would arrive and be able to hug their loved ones. Now, many of those children have no safe option, and therefore they're turning to the smugglers, who will put them in these flimsy dinghies in the most appalling of circumstances. And they will be arriving in Dover to go into one of those processing centres that we've heard about in the chaotic and poor conditions that we know have been reported on. So really, this situation here, I mean, it's another tragedy, and let's remember this is almost a year since the terrible tragedy that saw 32 people die in the Channel, and we've been warning for months that another tragedy is going to happen unless the government change approach and start to really constructively think about how to build back those safe routes for people to access to come here safely to reunite with family.
Anything that the Prime Minister announced yesterday in his big speech in the Commons that you think will help?
Very little, unfortunately. It was more of the same. It was more of the same failed approach that we've seen over the last few years. This idea that you can create such a hostile environment for people who fled war and persecution that they won't get in these boats has been categorically shown to fail over the last few years. People have got into a boat in the middle of the night, in the middle of winter, in freezing cold conditions. You imagine the desperation that those people are feeling in order to do that. And we know that creating an ever more hostile environment in the UK will not deter people from doing that, particularly when they have family links and other community ties here in the UK. And therefore, we have to offer them safe alternatives, to be able to come here safely, to be able to claim protection, and to be able to have their asylum claims processed fairly and quickly. And unfortunately, from the Prime Minister, we heard none of that yesterday. It was more promises of deterrence and hostile environment.
There will be those, though, who will be watching you, listening to this, Bethany, who will say, yes, we understand that these people have links to the UK. They maybe speak a little English. They maybe have family members here. But they are in a safe country. They are in a country where they are not being persecuted. They have left the regime that they were fleeing. The final step, this step across the Channel, does not need to be taken.
Look, there's a few things I'd say to that. Firstly, most refugees do remain in countries like France, in fact, in countries neighbouring to the countries that they've fled. France, but twice as many people stop in France, refugees stop in France, as they do seek to travel to the UK, every year. So it's, we are talking about a small number of people, and those people often have reasons why they're seeking to come to the UK, such as family. And I think most of us would agree that for the unaccompanied children that we're working with in northern France right now, who have fled their home countries, who have no family back home, who are fearing for their lives, they should be in the safe, loving care of a family member who is here in the UK. And we should be doing everything we can to provide them a safe way to get here and not see them turn to the smugglers who will then put them in these dangerous circumstances that risk their lives in such tragic circumstances.
Is there an argument for flipping this slightly and saying those loved ones that they want to be with in the UK, should they not be the ones that move, that go to the countries where their loved ones are and help them and assist them to come across in a different route, rather than them too knowing that their loved ones are going on these boats?
Well, I mean, we're talking about refugees here. We're talking about refugees who are on the move, who fled a country where they have feared for their lives or have experienced persecution. And the question we have to ask ourselves as Britain is, where are they best placed to be protected and to be in the care of their family? And if they have family here in Britain, then surely we should all acknowledge that they should be here. They should be in the company of their family, who are here, often settled, have lives established, who can help them rebuild their lives, after experiencing those situations back home. And to give you another example of this, we talk a lot about the lack of access to safe routes and safe ways for refugees to be able to come here. You think about what's going on in Iran right now. This year, we've resettled just 9 people from Iran. You think, and Iranians make up a high number of those who are crossing the channel in these perilous conditions right now. We're offering them no other option than to get in a boat in order to be able to come here and claim protection. And it just shouldn't be the case. And the government could take steps tomorrow to re-establish the safe family reunion route for refugees in Europe, and to start to build those safe routes that would act as a real alternative deterrent for people having to get into these dangerous dinghies.
OK, Bethany Gardner-Smith, good to talk to you today. Thank you very much for joining us on Sky. Well, earlier, Sky News spoke to the former Director General of the UK Border Force, Tony Smith, who spoke on Border Force operations on the beaches in France and what conditions would be like in the Channel.
We have been working with the French. There was a new agreement quite recently, actually, that we would place Border Force officers in France working on operations on the Calais beaches. You've had footage of what that environment is like. They don't want to be detected on the beaches, because if they are, they will be, the vessels will be disabled. They'll be stopped from crossing. So there's a game of cat and mouse going on along a very long stretch of French beach there between law enforcement and the smugglers. And so they will, resort to desperate measures. As you say, this will have been dark. It will have been cold. The people would have been frightened, but they would have been assured by the pilot or by somebody behind this, look, this is easy, don't worry about this, it's not very far, just get in here and everything's going to be okay. And that's what happens. So that's why the messaging is so important to people, that if we can get the message out, please do not engage with human smugglers to get across the English Channel. We have to stop this. We have to stop the boats, because I'm afraid this is highly, highly dangerous. As you say, you can just imagine what it must be like for some of those people that are in that boat in the dark, in those freezing temperatures, when a vessel runs into trouble on the English Channel. We cannot guarantee your safety. We can only do everything in our power to try and save lives, but we cannot guarantee that, because these are really, really difficult conditions and these are dangerous waters. And I'm afraid that message is not played up enough in this whole debate.
Well, let's bring in our correspondent Sadia Chowdhury, who is in Dungeness for us. And Sadia, what is the scene there? Is there anything actually happening there?
Well, look, we have been told that 3 people are confirmed to have died and 43 people have been rescued, but this continues to be an ongoing rescue operation with boats still out on the water. We've seen helicopters moving around as well. And it's likely to stay that way at least until it goes dark and at least until everyone has been accounted for. That's usually how these things operate. But these are really difficult conditions for rescue teams to be operating in. We know that the channel at this time of the year particularly is a very difficult place to be. The currents in the channel mean that people can be dispersed very quickly and very far away. What we do know is that around 3 this morning, a rescue operation was launched. The RNLI, Coast Guard vessels from the British Navy and the French Navy were involved in that operation. It would have been dark at that time. It would have been very difficult to operate in that time. But we know that 3 people have died and 43 people have been rescued. But as I say, it's an ongoing operation, so we don't know if those numbers will change. We also don't know who was on board that migrant vessel that is believed to be a migrant vessel that needed rescuing. Often many people will travel without documents. Maybe they don't speak English. It will be difficult to communicate and verify identities straight away. But it comes just a day after the Prime Minister made that announcement of a new package to stop these crossings. We've heard time and time again about how dangerous they are. And one thing I think we can be certain of is just how dangerous that journey is and just how desperate people must be to make that journey in the first place. But as I say, we don't know the identities of the people who are on board, and it does come just over a year after another vessel got into trouble in these waters. That was in November last year, when there were more fatalities, around 23 at that time.
Sadia, thanks very much. Thanks for bringing us the latest down there on the coast, on the English Channel there, not far from where that boat went down overnight. These are the latest images that we have. We have some images. We also have some moving pictures showing the helicopter above as well. But you could just see how damaged this boat appears to be. The fact that 43 people were rescued successfully from it is really quite astonishing. Joining me in the studio, Sky correspondents Tamara Cohen and Amanda Akas. And Tamara, what do you think the political fallout from this will be? You said a short while ago that you actually don't think it will really move the dial massively in terms of what the government does, whether policies change about how we deal with the issue of illegal migration, but also more specifically these small boats.
That's right. Rishi Sunak set out a bunch of measures yesterday which he had been promising and saying that this was his top priority as Prime Minister after the economy. And I imagine that he will say, we're going to hear from him at Prime Minister's Questions at 12 o'clock, that while he deeply regrets today's tragedy in which we believe there has been loss of life, and I'm sure he'll no doubt praise the emergency services' swift work as well, that what he announced yesterday in terms of deterrence is what he thinks the right route is to, as he puts it, stop the boats. Now, it's been pointed out a lot, including by many of his own MPs yesterday, that while the measures he's announced, sending people back to Albania, which he says is a safe country, moving their accommodation in the UK, trying to get the Rwanda scheme going and giving more money to the National Crime Agency to target some of the gangs, that all that will make a difference. It's not going to make an enormous difference and it's not going to happen overnight. There would need to be changes in legislation, which he said he'll look at next year, and that could all get bogged down and take a long time to happen. So we've had, certainly for the last 2 or 3 years, successive Prime Ministers and Home Secretaries saying we must tackle these channel boats, but not really managing to come up with anything that's not just a silver bullet, but that's really making a dent. I mean, the numbers just do keep going up. And in a sense, it's amazing that since last November, when tragically 30 people died, that we haven't had anything on that scale since then, because people are attempting these journeys. And as you can see from those pictures there, very overcrowded, perilous conditions in difficult weather. As Amanda was saying, people didn't used to attempt these crossings in the winter. It was a summer thing. Now it's all year round. And, you know, it's hard to see that he's going to suggest any kind of different approach, the approach that the charities are calling for, more safe routes. What he said yesterday is that the government has safe routes, but they're only, of course, for people from Ukraine, from Afghanistan and from Hong Kong. A lot of people from other countries find it very difficult to make asylum claims, and that's why they say they undertake these difficult journeys.
Thanks very much, Tamara. And Amanda, Tamara, just talking about the boats themselves, you, of course, have been out as a reporter in that area. You went out and on these patrols to see what was actually happening out there. What are the conditions like for those coming across?
Well, I think sometimes it can seem a bit deceptive because when the weather is calm and the sun is out, it seems like it's a very short stretch of sea, 23 miles or so. But of course, it is the world's busiest shipping lane, crisscrossed by these huge tankers, ferries. There are many vessels there who may not see a tiny boat, and I think that is the key thing, that these boats are really small. I think sometimes when you hear the numbers involved, we know that 43 people were rescued from this one. Sometimes you hear of 60, 70, 80 people on board these boats, but they're really not designed to hold that many people. Most of them are designed to hold a couple of dozen people, if that. And I think when you see them coming in, you can see how many people are crammed into this space, every inch of these little rubber dinghies, and they are rubber by and large. They suffer engine failure, they suffer from punctures, and the key thing, I think, from when I was out on one myself once, is that they are quite low in the water, and the more people you have on them, the lower they get. So as soon as you start getting choppier seas, or you start getting big backwash from some of those massive ships in the shipping lanes, you don't need a huge amount of water slopping over the edge to start really getting them at risk of capsizing or tipping, or indeed people being washed overboard. And I think the key thing about this being something that is operated by criminal gangs who don't, that the care for their passengers isn't their priority. People are spending £4,000 to £6,000 generally each, it's thought, per crossing. They make a lot of money. They make more money the more people they can shove in. Quite often we see migrants arriving not dressed appropriately at all, as we can see from some of these photos. They're often not wearing life jackets either. So, as soon as people get cold and wet, you don't have very long when the conditions are like this. So it really is extremely dangerous. And as you see people arriving, their faces when they get to the shore is generally an expression of real relief, and people immediately often being taken for medical treatment because it's very common for people to be suffering from hypothermia, which I think, given how difficult that crossing is, the deterrent approach, people clearly are very desperate to make it across. So I think the government's obviously hoping this message will get through to people in France, sleeping rough, who've travelled across Europe to try and make that crossing. I think when the Rwanda scheme, when we thought it was going to happen, there wasn't much evidence at the time that message had got through. Obviously, if it had been successful, maybe it would have done. But obviously, it is a complex approach, and clearly that's why they're also putting a lot of money into Border Force.
OK, Amanda, thanks very much. We've got some images we can bring you. A warning, we're about to show you some footage of the moment of rescue, which viewers may find distressing. These are the images that we've already seen of the boat being rescued in the Channel. Are we able to bring you those images? Let's bring in the Chief Executive of the Refugee Council, Enver Solomon, who joins us now. Enver, when I ask you about solutions, I know you are going to say, like the other charities that we've spoken to in the last hour, that the solution would be the government creating more safe routes for these people to get into our country. The government says that is not in their plan. So what can be done to prevent people making this terrifying journey?
Well, let's just first of all pause and remember who these people are. They're men, women and children like you and me, but unlike you and me, they don't have a safe place to live. They've had to flee, and they've had to do what any family would do when faced with violence and bloodshed, which is seek safety somewhere else. We saw the images of people fleeing for their lives in Ukraine. We saw what happened in Afghanistan when the Taliban stormed to power. We saw people clinging on aeroplanes. The majority of people coming across the channel are people who are fleeing war and violence and bloodshed. The main nationality in the last 2 months are Afghans, and people know what's happening in Afghanistan, followed by Iranians, and people see the stories on the news of the persecution and torture in Iran. These are people like you and me who have had no choice but to try and reach safety in another country. And we first and foremost need to recognise and understand that, because unless we see this as an issue which is driven by the fact that there is violence and bloodshed and persecution across the world, we won't be able to deal with it, because desperate people take desperate measures to try and reach safety. And that's the reality of the situation that we're seeing today, the real tragedy and those appalling images that viewers just saw of people desperately trying to reach safety.
And in terms of numbers then, let's talk numbers. As you say, we offered safe passage to some 150 Ukrainians. How many people do you think the government should say, right, you know, we're going to say 10,000 people can come from Iran, 10,000 people can come from Syria every year? Do you in your head have a sane amount of numbers that would be a proposal that you think that the government should offer?
Well, look, this isn't a numbers game. We know from the UN's figures that 100 million people were displaced. The figure of 100 million was reached back in summer for the numbers displaced around the world. Half of those, more than just over half, are actually displaced within countries. And then the vast majority of the remaining flee as refugees to neighbouring countries, places like Lebanon, next to Syria, that has hundreds of thousands of refugees, Pakistan, that has millions because of what's gone on in Afghanistan. A fraction seek asylum in other parts of the world, just under 5 million of that 100 million. And then a fraction of those will come to Europe. But it's the duty of Western nations, and that's why they signed the UN Convention on Refugees, to respond in a way that shares responsibility to provide safety to those that come in search of it in Europe and in countries like ours, in the UK. And that's what we should do. And that's what we've always sought to do. We should give them a fair hearing. There are people across this country who are making a huge contribution today, who came here fleeing horrendous atrocities 40 years ago in Uganda, fleeing the revolution in Iran back in 1979, fleeing the war in Yugoslavia, and more recently fleeing Syria. And they have contributed to this country as doctors, nurses, as architects, as businessmen, as business people. And that's what we should focus on, how we ensure we give them a fair hearing so that those who need protection go on and contribute as law-abiding citizens in the UK.
The problem is, of course, that whilst there are those who have legitimate reasons for wanting to come here and wanting to settle here, there are those who also don't. And we heard this from the Prime Minister yesterday in the Commons about the number of people who are travelling across illegally from Albania, which is still a safe country. And that is the problem, isn't it? That for you, for every legitimate refugee who has travelled from a war zone, there will be a person who is coming here as well, simply for economic reasons, and who is not fleeing those kind of persecutions.
Well, let's put it in context. Of course, there will be some people who don't have a well-founded fear of persecution, but the government's own figures show that more than 3/4 do, and more than 3/4 are allowed to stay in the UK as refugees. And if people, when they make an asylum application and the decision is made and it's found that they shouldn't be allowed to stay as refugees because they don't have a so-called genuine case, well, then we should work with them to return them with dignity to the country from which they've come from, in the way that other nations like Canada have proper voluntary returns programs. We don't do that at the moment. But we also need to ensure that people, when they come here, are given a genuine fair hearing. it's not good enough to simply say that it's safe in Albania, because we work with men and children and women who've come from Albania, who have been trafficked, who have been exploited. We work with children who are very seriously exploited as a consequence of the actions of criminal gangs. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't simply recognise them as refugees and turn them away and send them back to Albania. It means that we should recognise that they're unsafe. We should recognise they're victims of modern slavery and give them protection in the UK. And if they're not victims of modern slavery, of course, we don't accept them as refugees in this country. But the principle is that we give them a fair hearing. We always see the face behind the case. We always see them as individual humans who deserve a fair hearing in the UK.
Enver Solomon from the Refugee Council, thank you very much. Well, we spoke earlier with the Dover MP, Natalie Elphicke, and she pointed out that it was a matter of great urgency that the boats are stopped from entering the water from the French side.
Well, I'm very, very saddened to hear of this tragedy in the Channel today. Waking up to the news that I fear, as the MP for Dover and Deal, day after day, lives lost, a number saved only, 43 saved only due to the bravery and professionalism of the rescue services that operate out of Dover and along our East Kent coast. And I have to, pay tribute to their bravery and thank them for their rescue mission this morning in absolutely treacherous wintry conditions.
It must have been a horrific call out at 3 o'clock, mustn't it? In terms of what the solution is, what would you like to see the government do?
Well, as I've said now time and again, it is a matter of great urgency that the boats are stopped entering the water from France. People are safe in France. This is illegal criminality, organised crime through and through. That number of people crossing now very near to 45,000 people. That's the result of industrial illegal immigration by organised criminal gangs operating on the shores of France. It is urgent that the Prime Minister, who is taking personal responsibility for this issue, has a summit with President Macron, and that action is taken to bring this to an end before we have further loss of life in the Channel.
We spoke to Claire Mosley from the Care for Calais charity just a moment ago. She said one way to get the boats to not go in the water in France would be to set up a centre in northern France and offer safe passage to those who believe that they have a strong claim. Would that not be a solution?
Unfortunately, organisations like Care for Calais are part of the problem, not the solution, in dealing with the Channel crossings. Care for Calais is one of the organisations that's taking legal action against the government and is not, I think, really looking out for those solutions that would be in the best interests of people who are in the hands of these criminal gangs and often also in crime here in the UK once they are smuggled in and involved in modern slavery. We've got to, really be clear that those organisations are blocking the attempts of the government to be trying to bring an end to the small boats crossings. It is vital that they really look at the interests of people in the hands of criminal gangs, encourage them not to take these journeys that are so dangerous and do result, unfortunately and sadly, in loss of life. Encourage people instead to ask France for refugee assistance if they are in need of it, or any other country before they reach France, who is party to the same refugee conventions, and also to make it really, really clear that the majority of people who have been travelling by the small boats arriving in Britain in recent weeks are Albanians from a safe country and who are not in need of refuge or asylum. And it's absolutely vital that we take action and bring an end to this and stop these criminal gangs who are ruthless and do not care if they are risking lives in the pursuit of their illegal crime.
Do you dispute the figures that she provided us? We know that there is a particular problem with Albanians travelling across in recent weeks, but the figure that she quoted, 80% of those who reach the UK on these small boats are actually granted asylum.
Well, we know that our system in the UK is in need of reform, and the Prime Minister yesterday set out his 5-point plan for tackling that, which included
Sorry, I just wanted to press you on that actual figure, though. Is that as far as you understand it, is that a correct representation of the facts, that 80% of those who are come across on the small boats are eventually granted asylum?
Well, we know that once people are in the UK, it is extremely difficult to do anything but for the majority of people to stay in the UK, and that is why it is such a strong magnet for people to come in through illegal routes and try to get to Britain. That's why we have to be very, very clear that illegal immigration is not acceptable, that we do have... But we do, if I can finish, but we do have resettlement schemes that we operate with the United Nations, where we bring people directly from conflict areas. There are over 100 million people displaced around the globe. The right way to deal with refugee and asylum is to make sure that we have the systems and processes and support in place to help people. We do that. As the Prime Minister said yesterday, more humanitarian visas have been issued than since the Second World War. We are a generous country, but this is about illegal organised crime. And if we want to help people who are in need of assistance, they should not be taking this incredibly dangerous crossing. We've seen lives lost again today. We've got to bring it to an end.
But their point is, of course, that you say that they are illegal, but if 80% of them are granted asylum in the UK, it shows that they had a valid case, which therefore means that they are not illegal. They had a valid case for asylum, and they would argue that because there aren't the safe routes that they're able to use, they've been forced to take this action. The argument of many charities is if the British government had more safe routes, then they wouldn't have to get on the small boats.
There are safe routes of entry. We have issued, as the UK, more humanitarian visas than since the Second World War. There are safe passage routes. There are applications for work visas, which hundreds of thousands of people take. There are education visas. There are family reunion visas that you can apply in the UK from a room and a computer in the UK, so no family member needs to get into a boat or be in the hands of illegal immigration. Illegal entry to the UK is a crime. It is not the way to come to the UK. The UK does have resettlement and asylum programmes. It does give a tremendous amount of support around the globe, as well as to people who settle here in the UK. And it's absolutely vital that those two issues are not confused. To do so just drives up more illegal immigration. We need to tackle this at source and recognise this for the illegal activity that it is. There are safe and legal routes to come to the UK, and people must take those. They must not risk their lives or indeed lose their lives in the wintry sea in the Channel.
Frankly, everybody has been expecting something like this to happen. I have to say, honestly, I often think I'm surprised it doesn't happen more often, because so many of these boats leave from the beaches and you see them and they are clearly not seaworthy. They're very often fitted with engines that malfunction. I've seen boats leaving beaches and the engines are sort of spluttering and dying still within sight of them. And they are often overloaded. This boat appears to have had between 40 and 50 people on board it. I can guarantee you that if you had a choice, you would not be getting on a boat of that type with 49 other people. So no, there's nothing surprising about this at all. That the similar incident that happened last year, where 31 people died, was probably a culmination of a whole series of fears, as is this one nearly exactly a year later. And frankly, it's hard to think of a more atrocious situation to find yourself in. Charities that we've been in contact with this morning have told us that, well, one of them said that they were in contact with somebody on the boat, and they had the last conversation they had with them was at 2:53 in the morning. At that point, the Channel is inky black. It would have been very cold. The water, as you've been hearing, would have been freezing. And remember, this is the busiest shipping lane in the world. So it's a terrifying journey to make. And it is, to my mind, remarkable how many of these small boats actually get across the Channel without going to this sort of peril. But it's a measure of the desperation and the desire that people have. It's a point that seems obvious but is worth making. Everybody that you see in a migrant camp in Calais and Dunkirk and in those areas is only there for one reason. It's not because they like the northwest French coast. It's because they want to get to Britain, and they are going to try to do so on board a boat. It's not a question at that point of do they fancy it or do they not. They're going to try to get on a boat, and they're going to try and get across the channel. It used to be that at this time of the year, this sort of cross-channel migration on small boats sort of faded away. And when I say used to be, we're only talking about a relatively short space of time. But this year, and in fact last year, we've seen a change, and it's almost becoming a year-round exercise. And of course, it's incredibly perilous to be doing that journey in this weather. But also the conditions, if you exclude the freezing temperature, yesterday it seems as if conditions were good for taking a boat across. The people smugglers, they don't really think about the temperature. They're looking at the wind, and the wind is a factor here. And the wind, if it's calm, seems to have been in their favour. I have to tell you that I mean, if this number is confirmed, that 43 people have been rescued, that would seem to be a really very, very high number. The fears among many people were of multiple fatalities. French hospitals have been warned that they would expect the potential for a significant number of fatalities. If this figure correct is 43 rescued, that will be, despite the fact that clearly people may well have died in this, that will be a really sort of pleasingly high number of people to have been taken from an incident of this kind.
Is the country grinding to a halt, Prime Minister? Will your government get a grip on strikes?
Usually the UK's want to win the election.
Well, the Prime Minister there leaving number 10 Downing Street ahead of taking questions in the House of Commons very shortly. Prime Minister's questions is due to start at 12 o'clock. We always preview what is expected to be happening in the Commons. Joining me now here in the studio in Westminster, my panel of MPs. For the Conservatives, Brendan Clark-Smith, very good to see you. Labour's Steve Reid and the SNP's Alan Smith. Thank you all very much. Brendan Clark-Smith, to you first of all. In terms of what has happened over the last few hours, the news that we're getting coming out of the Channel, this is another incident of a number of people almost losing their lives. Luckily, it seems just 43 people rescued. Does this change anything with the Prime Minister's strategy that he announced yesterday for dealing with migration?
I don't think so, Jane. I think this illustrates exactly the problem that we've got before us. I mean, this is an absolute tragedy. It shows, again, the criminal gangs and people smugglers that are causing this. We've got to clamp down on it. I'd like to thank all of the emergency services, all the responders who've actually made this far less of a tragedy than it actually could have been. I heard that there are 3 dead, 43 rescued. So thank you so much to the people who've actually got in there. But we've got to stop this from happening. I think the comprehensive set of measures announced yesterday is going to be part of doing that.
Steve, for Labour, the campaigners that we've spoken to this morning have said that the problem is that whatever the government announced yesterday, it doesn't create more safe routes. The Prime Minister said he will create more safe routes, but it's much further down the line. Do you think that is something the government should be doing?
Well, I mean, first off, I want to express my sympathy for the loss of life. You know, it's shocking, and it does show us why there needs to be a grip got on this issue, and the government just hasn't. And, you know, safe routes would be part of it, but stopping the criminal gangs that are putting people on these boats and putting their lives at risk in this way has to be part of it. But we also have to look at why so many people are coming to our country. And one of the reasons is because the government has simply not been processing applications. So people come here and they can stay for years because no one checks. They only process 4% of applicants every year, which is why the hotels are jam-packed of refugees who are waiting interminably for years for cases to be resolved. And that's costing the British taxpayer £6 million a year because, frankly, the immigration and asylum seeker system is broken. And who broke it? It's this government that's been in power for 12 years now.
Brendan, is that a fair allegation? The system is broken. I mean, it seems to be that successive Home Secretaries have acknowledged that there are fundamental issues with the problem, with the situation. They try to fix it, but nothing really seems to change.
Certainly very difficult, yes. And I think I'm not going to disagree with what Steve said about processing applications. We know there's a backlog there. The Prime Minister acknowledged this yesterday, and we're looking at a threefold increase on how quickly they're going to be processed now. And there's quite an ambitious target to actually clear that by the end of next year. But, of course, the backlog is only part of the problem. We need to stop them coming over in the first place. And, of course, once we've dealt with those claims, we need to be able to remove people, especially when they've come from safe countries. That's why we've done a deal with Albania. That's why we're doing deals with France. That's why we're increasing the number of Border Force staff that are in there. And that's why we're also looking at cutting, of course, the cost of these hotels, which we don't want to see. We want to be spending money on public services. We don't want to be spending it on this.
But you know, did you know that your government identified 16,000 people for removal to safe countries over the last 2 years? Do you know how many actually got removed? 21. That is a government that's frankly given up on the immigration system. 3 years ago, Priti Patel told us she had cut the number of small boats coming across the Channel in half. It actually increased 20-fold. If they have any ideas, they'd have put them into action already. They've completely lost a grip and they don't know what to do.
But I'd also put the point, we've had things such as the Nationality and Borders Bill, we've had things such as the Rwanda scheme. Then. They've been opposed at every point, Steve, by your party and by others there. And of course, when we've tried to do that, we've tried to send people back, we've had litigation, we've had activist lawyers jumping in. And we've had to lay the foundations with legislation to get around that. But what we're also doing is we're making sure we have plans that we can actually deliver on. And that's what the Prime Minister was saying. Some have said that involves the ECHR and whether you have to come out of that. But the Prime Minister's actually done something that I think we can achieve without doing that. And that was the point he was making yesterday. Yes, it's a problem, but we're dealing with it. Others, they're trying to block it.
Alan, let's bring in Alan Smith from the SNP. What's your view on this? I mean, obviously, you look at the borders and the coast of Kent, it feels a long way from people, you know, thinking about politics in Aberdeen. But what's the SNP's view?
Well, no, it feels very close to people in Aberdeen. The people of Scotland are horrified with what's happening on the UK government's watch, and this point scoring isn't going to solve anything. Now, this is not a unique problem to the UK. I was a member of the European Parliament for 16 years. We're seeing dreadful situations in the Aegean, in the Mediterranean as well. And what we need to do is to look further upstream as to why we can all agree that criminal gangs are dreadful people who need to be cracked down on. But the root cause of this is that there are desperate people fleeing turmoil and war in their own countries, trying to get here for sanctuary and for safety. And there are not sufficient routes to get them there. And I would agree, I think we'd all agree, the UK asylum processing system has been massively, grossly underfunded as a matter of deliberate government policy. And they're now trying to claim that that needs a further crackdown on the boats. Obviously, people risking their lives at sea is a dreadful, dreadful situation, but it's a sign of failure that we need to look at in the totality of it. I would suggest we need more European cooperation. We need safer routes to get people from places of harm to places of sanctuary. We're not seeing that at the moment, and tackling the symptoms in a political blame game is just not going to cut it.
In terms of safer routes, Brendan, the Prime Minister did say there would be some, but he said, you know, once we've got a grip on the situation, which suggests not imminently, at least. And that seems to be the one thing that all of the refugee charities and the charities that work with those trying to come across in this way agree on, that they argue that 80% of those people who are on these boats, when their asylum claims are actually processed in the UK, are granted asylum, which suggests they have a legitimate grounds for asylum. They are people who would be applying through safe routes if they existed, they say.
Well, I'd say the safe routes do exist. They've existed for Ukraine, for Syria, for Afghanistan, of course, for Hong Kong as well. So we have had these safe routes there. But, of course,
but those are only for specific countries that we pick. There are lots of people from lots of other countries, aren't there?
Well, it's about a European approach as well, and it's about looking with other countries and taking our fair share, which I believe we've also done. But, of course, many are also economic migrants. Now, if you are an economic migrant, of course, there are many legal routes for that. If you've got the skills and qualifications that you can bring to this country. I've done it before as an immigrant when I've been abroad as well. So there are the paths there to do it. But I think what you're looking at is many who are looking at cheating the system at the moment. There's widespread criminality. You look at the number of men that are on these boats. You look at a third of the people coming over from Albania, a safe country. I think there are people really, they want a fair immigration system, a humanitarian system, but what they don't want to see is to be cheated. It's all about fairness, Jane, and we really are committed to that.
And that's a fair point, isn't it, Steve? That a lot of people will look at these images and will have looked at previous images in the past and say, you know, these are not all people who are fleeing from conflict zones.
No,
why should we take them
that's
into the
the
country?
point. That's why Labour has been.
It makes people very angry.
It makes all of us very angry. And, you know, what Labour's been calling for a long time now is to properly resource the immigration and border staff so that we can process these applications faster and then remove those who do not have a right to come here as asylum seekers. But the government's done neither. There's a big backlog because they're not processing, and then for the few they do process, they don't remove. So the government's got it wrong. What Labour's calling for is much closer cooperation with the French authorities, the Belgian authorities and Europol, so they can tackle at source the people smugglers who are responsible for bringing so many of these individuals to Calais. It's no accident that all the small boats you see are exactly the same. There are smuggler gangs behind that, but the government hasn't cracked down on that either. So pretty much wherever you look in the whole chain that leads to this crisis, the government has been negligent.
Very briefly, Alan Smith, the SNP, would you like to see more migrants being taken up to Scotland? Do you think there's more space, there are more homes, there are more vacancies up there? People would welcome having more migrants there?
I'm very proud of the fact that Scotland has per capita taken far more than our fair share. And I would pick up on the point that the UK has taken its fair share. Look at the European statistics. The UK has taken nothing like its fair share, particularly from Ukraine. Look at how many people Ireland has given safe haven to and given sanctuary to. Now, there's a distinction between asylum and immigration. And I do accept that some folks crossing the Channel are economic migrants, but that's why the system to process them needs to be better resourced than it is. The idea that this is all about criminal gangs needing cracked down on is just to really miss the point. And what we do need is a much wider discussion about this.
OK, she doesn't always have a musical interlude as she arrives in breaking news. Beth has arrived. Beth, we've been talking about this dreadful situation in the Channel all morning, but the Prime Minister's questions, obviously the last one before Christmas. Do you think that this will dominate, or do you think actually he will want to focus on what he was hoping he would focus on in here?
Look, I think they will mention it at the top of PMQs, but there is a Home Secretary statement after Prime Minister's questions on this case unfolding in the Channel. What's going on? We think that 3 people have died, and we think that at the moment 43 people have been potentially taken out of the Channel. That's the latest information we have from our reporters who are covering that. But what will Keir Starmer go on? I think this week he will tackle strikes head on, and he will criticise the government for what he will say is inaction in trying to resolve pay disputes. I think that Labour will go quite strongly on the nurses' strike tomorrow, one on the 15th, one on the 21st. One source saying to me previously it's felt like this is chaos. Now this week it's genuinely terrifying, is what one of my Labour sources are telling me in terms of the nurses' strike. We got that letter last night, Jane, that was from Dame Callie, who's the head of cancer care for the NHS England, asking nurses to have a national derogation. That means to effectively protect emergency and urgent cancer care, worries about patient ops being delayed, and what does that mean for people's longevity or life-saving treatment. There's also a letter in the Times today from some leading nurses saying that they're also concerned about patient care, and it's a really uneasy time, isn't it? Nurses have never gone on strike, and tomorrow they're set to go on strike, and what's the knock-on effect for people needing acute care or people falling very ill? Will they get the treatment they need? And I think that that is where Keir Starmer will go for the government and go for Rishi Sunak. I guess the question is how Rishi Sunak responds to that. In the past, he has accused Keir Starmer of being in the pocket of the unions and failing to stand up for them themselves. But I think Labour have a view that the government's refusal, if you like, to reopen pay negotiations with nurses this week is something that he can really attack the government on.
And what about the economy? Inflation dropped slightly today.
Inflation's dropped slightly. Look, we thought that October would be the peak. It's fallen back to, I think, 10.7% from 11.1 in October. Look, we expect inflation to dip back to 2% towards the end of the year, according to independent forecasts. But of course, in the meantime, people are really struggling with the cost of living, struggling to make ends meet and feeling really the sharp end of that cost of living crisis, and that inflation is still huge for people when their wages are going up 3 to 4% in the public sector and inflation's running at 10.7%.
Well, it is 12 o'clock. You're watching Sky News. Prime Minister's Questions is just about to begin. We think the Prime Minister is going to take to his feet any minute now.
I can generally say to the Honourable Lady that the atmosphere in the relationships between the European Union and the United Kingdom government have changed dramatically in recent weeks and months, and that is the basis for all good things.
That completes those questions. Before we come to Prime Minister's Questions, I would like to point out the British Sign Language interpretation of proceedings available to watch on Parliament Live TV. We start with questions to Prime Minister John Stevenson.
Number one, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the whole House will share my sorrow at the capsizing of a small boat in the Channel in the early hours of this morning and the tragic loss of human life. Our hearts go out to all those affected and our tributes to those involved in the extensive rescue operation. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, in addition to my duties in this House, including the visit of His Majesty the King. I shall have further such meetings later today.
John Stevenson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, a 3.5-hour journey takes 6 hours. A straight journey ends up with 2 changes and a diversion. A train is cancelled at short notice. This has become the experience of a West Coast rail passenger. If Avanti do not get their act together, will the government cancel their franchise?
Very popular question, Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for raising this, and I share the frustration that this is causing to many of his and other communities. Our priority immediately is to support the restoration of services before then making any long-term decisions on the operation of the West Coast franchise, but we will be closely monitoring Avanti's rollout of its recovery plan and holding them account for delivering for passengers.
Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister? Our prayers go out to those who capsized in the freezing waters of the Channel last night. It's a reminder that the criminal gangs running those routes put the lives of the desperate at risk and profit from their misery. They must be broken up and brought to justice. Mr. Speaker, tomorrow will be the first ever nationwide nurses' strike. All the Prime Minister has to do to stop that is to open the door and discuss pay with them. If he did, the whole country would breathe a sigh of relief. Why won't he?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we have consistently spoken to all the unions involved in all the pay disputes that there are. But I am glad he's raised our nurses, because they do incredible work, and it's worth putting on record. It's worth putting on record what exactly we have done for our nurses. Last year, when everyone else in the public sector had a public sector pay freeze, the nurses received a 3% pay rise. When the RCN asked for more in-work training, we gave every nurse and midwife a £1,000 training budget. And when they asked for nurses' bursaries, we made sure that every nursing student received a £5,000 grant. That's because we do work constructively, and we will continue to back our nurses.
Mr. Speaker, nurses going on strike is a badge of shame for this government. Instead of showing leadership, he's playing games with people's health. And there is a human cost. Alex from Chester has been waiting for a gallbladder operation for nearly 6 months. He's in so much pain, he's been off school since then. His operation has already been cancelled twice. His mum, who I spoke to this morning, is worried sick. When she heard that strikes could be called off, she was massively relieved. She's desperate for the Prime Minister to resolve this. All he needs to do is simply meet the nurses. Now, Alex's mum is listening to this. She doesn't want to hear him blaming everybody else. She doesn't want his usual ducking of the question. She's tuned in now because she wants him to explain what is he going to do to resolve the nursing strike.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's not just Alex. There are millions of others across this country, Alex and Mark, millions of others who will have their healthcare disrupted because of the strike. Now, the honourable gentleman says to get round the table, but we all know what that means, Mr. Speaker. That is just simply a political formula for avoiding taking a position on this issue. If he thinks the strikes are wrong, he should say so. If he thinks it's right that pay demands of 19% are met, then he should say so. What's weak, Mr. Speaker, is he's not strong enough to stand up to the union.
Mr. Speaker, we know it's Christmas, but the party's not started yet. Come on, kiss off.
Mr. Speaker, in 12 hours' time, there's a nurses' strike. All he needs to do is meet the nurses. His inaction speaks volumes. As ever with this Prime Minister, it's Tory politics first, patients second. We've never seen a nurses' strike like this before. They've been forced into it because the government has broken the health system. Ask anyone in the NHS. They will tell you they don't have enough staff. 133,000 vacancies. And there's an obvious solution. Scrap the non-dom status and use the money to bring through the next generation of doctors and nurses. That's what Labour would do. Why hasn't he got the guts to do it?
Mr. Speaker, we're already investing billions more in the NHS. We're already hiring thousands more doctors and nurses. But he asked about backlog. He asked about backlogs and the waiting times in the NHS. And yes, what he always fails to acknowledge is the impact that COVID did, Mr. Speaker. That's why we're facing pressures. But we do have a plan. Not just more money, not just more doctors and nurses, new diagnostic centres carrying out millions of checks and scans, new surgical hubs delivering more elective surgery. But if we'd listened to him, Mr. Speaker, the backlog would still be growing, and that's because we'd still be in lockdown.
As usual, Mr. Speaker, he tries to blame everyone else. His department commissioned a report into the NHS which reported on Monday. That report said we've had 10 years of managed decline. It was not COVID. Responsibility is sitting right there. And the reason he can't choose nurses over non-doms is because he's too weak to stand up for tax avoiders. For 12 years, they haven't trained enough doctors and nurses. So we have the absurd situation of the NHS spending billions on agency workers to fill the gap. Why should the country have to put up with money that should be spent treating patients being wasted plugging gaps instead?
Mr. Speaker, let me tell the honourable gentleman what we are doing. We are actually listening to the independent pay review bodies. They want to undermine them. We've offered a fair pay deal. They can't even decide on a number amongst themselves. We're actually protecting the public. They're protecting their paymasters, Mr. Speaker. For working people in this country, it's Labour's nightmare before Christmas.
Here's Starmer. There he goes again, pretending everything is fine. Try telling that to those on waiting lists or those that can't afford to pay for a next-day GP appointment. After 12 years of Tory failure, winter has arrived for our public services. And we've got a Prime Minister who has curled up in a ball and gone into hibernation. If he can't act on behalf of patients or nurses or everyone who wants these strikes called off, then surely the whole country is entitled to ask, what is the point of him and what is the point of the government he's supposed to be leading?
Mr. Speaker, he talks about COVID not having an impact. Ambulance waiting times for Category 1 Category 1 ambulance waiting times in February of 2020 were actually completely on target, Mr. Speaker. COVID has an impact, and that's why, as the Chief Executive of the NHS has acknowledged, this government is serious about its commitment to prioritise the NHS. But, Mr. Speaker, let's just have a look at the NHS in Labour-run Wales, shall we? The worst A&E times in the country, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, under the last Labour government, we had fair pay for nurses and no strikes.
Yeah.
So I won't be taking lectures from him about that.
Order. Mr. Bowie, you promised to behave. Don't give me a Christmas present you won't want. Come on, Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, this is our final PMQs of the year. So I hope you will Oh, really? I hope you will... Mr. Speaker, what I was going to say was I hope you will pass on all of our thanks, at least on this side, to all those who kept our House and our democracy working. Yeah. And I want to finish this year thinking about our friends in Ukraine. As a result of Putin's barbaric assault on their freedom, millions will spend Christmas in sub-zero temperatures without heating, electricity or hot water. Their suffering is unimaginable, but their bravery is awe-inspiring. So will the Prime Minister join me in saying that whatever other difficulties and disagreements we have across this dispatch box, we are and will remain united in our unwavering support for Ukraine's freedom, its liberty and its victory?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I join with the honourable gentleman in thanking and paying tribute to all the staff of the House for the fantastic work that they do to support all of us. And I appreciate his comments on Ukraine. It has been a point of incredible unity across this House and indeed the country, something that we can all be proud of in our country, that we have stood behind Ukraine at its hour of need. And as I said yesterday, this Christmas, many families will be laying an extra place at their Christmas table, and that speaks to the generosity and compassion of our nation, and long may that continue.
Angela Richards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The A3 connects London to Portsmouth through Guildford, and I was delighted to see the new Solent Freeport announced last week, which will increase traffic flows. As the A3 narrows through Guildford, it is sadly the most polluted road in the strategic road network. Short-term sticking plasters like putting up 9-metre-high air pollution barriers that will entrench divisions in Guildford is not acceptable to me or my constituents. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that it is time to think big, it is time to think long-term, and it is time to tunnel the A3 under Guildford?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for the question. I know this is an issue that she has long championed. I am told that National Highways are developing a range of different possibilities and solutions for the A3 through Guildford, and I know the Department for Transport will consider the case as it plans its future infrastructure investments.
SNP leader Stephen Flynn.
I wish to join with the Prime Minister and the Leader of Opposition in extending my party's thoughts to all of those involved in the terrible tragedy in the Channel this morning. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, thanks to positive and proactive negotiations between the Scottish Government and Unite and Unison health unions, a pay settlement has been reached and strike action averted. Yep. By stark contrast, the UK Health Secretary appears completely unwilling to negotiate with unions on pay, and strike action is very much still on the table. Shame. So may I ask the Prime Minister, when will he see the error of his ways and follow the Scottish Government's lead?
Yeah. Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm glad the UK Government was able to provide £1.5 billion in extra funding to the Scottish Government for public services. The Health Secretary and other ministers have engaged fully, not just with the unions, but with an independent pay-setting process, which takes the politics out of the process and ensures that we can meet those independent requirements with a fair pay deal.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, let's be clear, those words will ring hollow in the ears of those people who, unlike the Prime Minister, can't nip into Waitrose for their shopping, nor indeed even turn on their heating at this moment in time. And that's particularly true for people in Scotland, because as we know, average energy bills in Scotland are not anticipated to be £2,500 per year. They're expected to be £3,300 per year. People are genuinely terrified, and that's despite the fact that Scotland produces 6 times more gas than we consume, with some 80% of our electricity coming from low-carbon sources. Decades of failed UK energy and regulatory policy coming home to roost. Is it not the case that Scotland has the energy? We just need the power.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm glad the honourable gentleman raised the question of energy support. And it's because of the actions of this government that we are providing every household in this country with around £900 of support with their energy bills this winter, £55 billion worth of support. And on top of that, next year, there will be extra cost of living payments worth up to £1,200 for the most vulnerable, whether that's those on means-tested benefits, pensioners, or indeed disabled. This is a government that will always look after the most vulnerable in our society.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my right honourable friend will know, the Mayor of London, despite objections, has decided to expand the ULEZ zone across all London boroughs, which will massively impact my constituents and those who share a border with London. Will he therefore urgently speak to the Transport Secretary and encourage him to use the powers at his disposal to reverse this disastrous decision?
Well, my honourable friend will know that transport in London is devolved to the Labour Mayor of London, but it is disappointing that the Mayor, backed by the Leader of the Opposition, is choosing not to listen to the public. The zone is being expanded against the overwhelming views of residents and businesses, and I'd urgently consider the Mayor and the gentleman opposite to be on the side of hard-working Londoners.
David!
Can I associate myself and my party with the comments made by others on the tragedy in the Channel? Our thoughts and prayers are with the families' victims. Mr. Speaker, 40% of cancer patients now wait more than 2 months for treatment after an urgent referral from a GP. That's the highest proportion on record and way above the government's own cancer waiting target. I lost both my parents to cancer as a child, and so, like many people across the country and in this House, I know the devastating impact of treatment delays on cancer patients and their families. So I'd like to ask the Prime Minister 2 questions. First, can he give a cast-iron guarantee that the dreadful cancer backlog won't get any worse? And second, when will the government meet its own cancer target?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm very sorry to hear about the right honourable gentleman's parents. Indeed, I'm sure many of us across this House have our families have been tragically affected by what cancer does, and he's right to raise the importance of meeting our targets. And what I am able to tell him is we actually are experiencing very high numbers of cancer referrals following the pandemic. He'll be aware of that. But thanks to the brilliant work of our NHS staff, cancer treatment rates in the most recent month for which we have data are now back at pre-pandemic levels, with a plan for them to increase further. And recently, the NHS also announced plans to fast-track patients direct to cancer tests rather than have to wait for specialist consultation first. These measures will make a difference, and I look forward to updating on them in the new year.
Terry Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the closure of the last bank in Cheadle, yet another of my local communities has been left totally bereft of a high street banking service. So I was pleased when I heard the announcement that Cheadle was to get a banking hub. Unfortunately, my delight was short-lived. When on closer inspection I saw that it was Cheadle, Staffordshire. Whilst I remain pleased for the other Cheadle, would my right honourable friend agree with me that my constituents also need access to cash and banking facilities to protect businesses and support our high street? And will he support our local calls for post office banking hubs?
Prime Minister. My honourable friend is a fantastic champion for Cheadle in Greater Manchester. She will know that the Financial Services and Markets Bill will establish a legislative framework for protecting access to cash, and alongside this, firms are already working to provide shared services, as she mentioned, like bank hubs. But what I would encourage my honourable friend to do is to contact Link, which can undertake an independent assessment of a community's cash access needs and determine if shared facilities are appropriate.
Fabian Hamilton.
Mr. Speaker, my constituent Sharon has an 11-year-old daughter who suffers from eating disorders and severe anorexia. She was forced to spend a year in hospital in Sheffield, 40 miles away, because there were no beds in Leeds for children with those eating disorders. This, Mr. Speaker, is completely unacceptable. So will the Prime Minister now commit to ensuring that NHS mental health provision for young people is dramatically improved so that no other family has to ever again endure similar trauma?
Minister.
Well, first of all, can I say to Sharon and her family, I'm sorry about what she's experienced. The honourable gentleman makes an excellent point. Mental health funding, as he knows, is increasing, so we ensure parity of service. He's also right to raise the issue of eating disorders. It's something that provision is currently expanding for. I think 2,000 more children were given the treatment and advice and support they needed last year, and there are plans to go further because it's an issue that needs tackling.
Jason McCullough.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Police Constable Nicola Hughes and PC Fiona Bone were savagely murdered in Manchester whilst on duty a decade ago. Nicola's dad, Bryn, is my constituent. He lives in Marsden. He was in Parliament again last week, continuing his campaign for emergency service workers and police officers who die whilst on duty to be awarded the Elizabeth Medal posthumously. Does my right honourable friend agree with me and Bryn that now is the time to commemorate and honour our brave police officers and emergency service workers who make the ultimate sacrifice by awarding posthumously the Elizabeth Medal?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for his question, and I thank his constituent Bryn for his campaigning. Every life lost in the line of duty is a tragedy, and we remember the lives and service of PC's Nicola Hughes and Fiona Bone. We are determined, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that sacrifice that police officers and other public service officers make is recognised, and we are carefully considering the best and most appropriate ways to do this.
Kirsty Blackman.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Across these islands, people are suffering because of the woefully inadequate policies of this UK Tory government. They've crashed the economy, left millions in fear of the cold this winter, and are stoking division over striking workers rather than negotiating fair pay deals. Why is it that the only people that can rely on this Prime Minister are questionable PPE suppliers in the House of Lords, bankers, and former Prime Ministers getting taxpayer-funded handouts to defend their partying through COVID?
Mr. Speaker, the only people stoking division in our United Kingdom are the party opposite.
Question, Michael Fabricant.
Question 12, sir.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our priorities are growth, investing in public services and giving businesses the confidence they need to invest. I look forward to discussing this with the Mayor of the West Midlands.
Michael Fabricant.
Mr. Speaker, when my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, recently visited the National Memorial Arboretum, he was slightly late. But I don't blame him because he had to come by road. Now, my friend, the Mayor of the West Midlands, is supporting an extension of the cross-city line from Birmingham using an existing freight line to make it into a rail service to the National Memorial Arboretum and beyond. So, may I ask my right honourable friend, will he revisit the National Memorial Arboretum again, see the Armed Forces Memorial, and also come to Lichfield and see why we need a leisure centre?
I'd be delighted to come and visit the National Memorial Arboretum again, see my friend and the fantastic Mayor of the West Midlands, Andy Street, to discuss his plans to drive growth and opportunity in the region.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is now well over 3 years since the Conservatives promised the end no-fault evictions. Enfield has the highest rate of Section 21 evictions in London. 30 families in my constituency in the last month alone were made homeless as a result of Section 21. I have families sat in my office trying to keep warm as we try to find them emergency accommodation. Will the Prime Minister scrap this shameful legislation? If so, when?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady will know that we have announced plans to do that and we await parliamentary time. But it's not the only thing we are doing to protect renters, Mr. Speaker. We have passed legislation already to protect tenants from rip-off fees, and we've capped holding deposits because we want to make sure that renters do have the protections that they require and they have their decent homes to rent.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Small modular reactors are a hugely important part of our future energy mix. And this Conservative government realised that when it awarded Rolls-Royce nuclear section, based in my constituency, a grant of £210 for development. But there's still no clarity or plan for moving from development to deployment. Will the Prime Minister come with me to meet Rolls-Royce to discuss how to move things forward and ensure the UK benefits from this exciting opportunity?
Well, my honourable friend makes an excellent point. I'm delighted that government has awarded £210 million to Rolls-Royce SMR last year for research and development. This does have the potential to benefit the UK and support our energy security and climate goals. I look forward to getting updates and for working with my honourable friend to see this fantastic new technology come to life.
McCarthy.
When my constituent who has dementia was taken ill recently, it took 3 hours for an ambulance to arrive. He then spent 10 hours in the back of an ambulance outside A&E, queuing to get in. And the doctor said to him, "I'm so sorry, we're treating you out of the back of a truck." But as we've heard, the King's Fund has said that the government has presided over a decade of neglect of managed decline in the NHS. So isn't it the Prime Minister, not that doctor, who should be apologising?
Well, Mr. Speaker, that same King's Fund report also acknowledged that there was 40% more funding going into the NHS under this Conservative government. But we do need to make sure that that funding makes a difference. That's why this winter £500 million is being deployed to move people out of hospital beds into social care, to speed up those discharges specifically so that ambulances won't be queuing as much as they currently are. And that money is already making a difference on the ground.
Saki Batty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The community in Kingshurst, which I represent, has suffered an unimaginable tragedy earlier this week when 4 children fell through the ice at Babsmill Lake. Sadly, 3 of the children did not survive, and one, a 6-year-old, is fighting for his life. They and their families are all in my thoughts and prayers. Will my right honourable friend pay tribute to the community in Kingshurst, which has come together and is supporting each other to get through this tragedy? And will you recognise the heroic efforts of the emergency services, including the police officer who used his bare hands to try and break through the ice and then jumped in the water with fire service personnel without the PPE, risking their own lives to save the young children?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend, and can I send my condolences to the family and friends of all of those who lost their lives. I also join him in paying tribute to our emergency services for, as he said, their incredibly selfless actions. This whole event has completely shocked the local community, and I know that my honourable friend will continue to do all he can to support his constituents at this difficult time.
Dame Angela Riedel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This year, the Tory party has given us 5 education secretaries, 4 chancellors, 3 prime ministers, 2 leadership coups. And Mr. Speaker, the Partridges had to sell the pear tree to pay the gas. So, Mr. Speaker, isn't it the case that after a year of Tory chaos, incompetence and self-indulgence, the best Christmas present the Prime Minister could give to the British people is a general election?
Mr. Speaker, they're happier with that than before, Mr. Speaker. But all I'd say, when it comes to what the British people need this Christmas, Mr. Speaker, in order to ease the disruption on their lives, the best thing that the party opposite could do is tell their union bosses to call off these damaging strikes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After the Second World War, Winston Churchill sent British Conservative lawyers to help to draft the European Convention on Human Rights, and that's something that we can be proud of in this country. But in an age of mass migration, the ECHR is now limiting our ability to control our borders. So in light of the tragedy in the Channel this morning, does the Prime Minister agree he should do as Churchill did, draft a new framework for refugees and human rights, including legal routes, but one way or another, and if necessary alone, we must be prepared to leave the ECHR?
Mr. Speaker, as I told the House yesterday, our new legislation will deliver a system whereby a person who comes here illegally will have no right to stay and will be removed to their own country or a safe third country alternative. That is the system that the British people want to see. That's a system that we will deliver, and I look forward to hearing whether the party opposite will support it.
Sir Olney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As temperatures are plummeting and the cost of living crisis is deepening, ordinary families are facing a Dickensian nightmare across the country this Christmas. Mortgage bills are soaring, household repossessions are up, and nearly 500,000 tenants face a threat of eviction after falling behind on their rent. Too many people are worrying about where they and their children will wake up on Christmas morning. So will the Prime Minister agree to a temporary ban over the festive period on repossessions and evictions so that nobody has to live in fear of losing their home this Christmas?
Mr. Speaker, we provide a range of support to both homeowners and tenants who are in difficulty already. But the most important thing we are doing to financially support them through the winter is by providing almost £900 of support with their energy bills, on top of all the additional support for those who are most vulnerable, including pensioners. That demonstrates the actions of this government to help the country get through what we acknowledge is a challenging time.
Stephen Crow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tomorrow, Mr. Speaker, at 9:30, you'll lead this House in a 1-minute silence to mark 80 years since the British government recognised that the Holocaust was taking place in Nazi-occupied Europe. As we come together to mark that moment, will the Prime Minister join me in praising the Holocaust Educational Trust and the extraordinary survivors who continue to do amazing work, ensuring that the next generation understand and learn the lessons from the past?
Minister. Mr. Speaker, 80 years ago, Parliament listened in stunned silence as the truth of the Holocaust was spoken in this House for the very first time. So it's absolutely right that you, Mr. Speaker, lead a moment of silence in which we will stand together to remember and reaffirm that truth. I join my honourable friend in paying tribute to the work of the Holocaust Educational Trust, and it could not be more fitting that Britain's Holocaust Memorial and Learning Centre should be built right next door to here to Parliament. We must never forget the Holocaust, and we must stamp out anti-Semitism and prejudice in all its forms, wherever we find it.
Chris Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Caerphilly County Borough Council recently announced a £3 million cost of living hardship fund to help those most in need in Islwyn and across our county borough. Does the Prime Minister think it's right that local authorities are forced to cover the costs of 12 years of economic mismanagement by this Tory government?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, what the honourable gentleman fails to acknowledge is that because of the actions of this UK government, not only are we supporting people in Wales and across the United Kingdom with help with their energy bills, we've also provided £1.2 billion of extra funding for the Welsh government to use to give to local authorities to support their constituents, and he would do well to acknowledge the benefits of the United Kingdom and the actions of the UK government.
We have a record 4,000 newly qualified doctors training to be GPs, which is really excellent. But we do have an issue with retention, which is made even worse in areas like mine, which have extremely high housing growth. As the son of a GP, what will the Prime Minister do to fix this?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know this is an issue that my honourable friend has talked and championed for a long time, and he's right to do so. We do have record numbers of GPs in training at the moment. We're also making sure that we support primary care appointments and primary care access, and I know that my honourable friend, the Health Secretary and Chancellor, are looking at how best we can increase retention, particularly with regard to pensions, and I look forward to getting his suggestions.
Final question, Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In a written response from the DWP, it was confirmed to me that an unpaid carer earning more than £132 a week in their job is classed as being in gainful employment and as a result loses their carer's allowance of £69.70 a week. Now, caring doesn't stop. It never stops. So can the Prime Minister explain to me the rationale of this decision, given that we are trying to get economically inactive people back into work? And secondly, can he explain why it's his government's position that £132 a week is enough for people to live on?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I first start by paying tribute to those up and down the country who give up so much of their time to care for others. And I'm actually delighted that the government is supporting the honourable member's bill, which will give a week of highly flexible paid leave to unemployed carers. I think it's the right thing to do, and I'm grateful that the honourable lady is taking it forward. The carers allowance is a means-tested benefit. It's part of many other benefits that are available to support people, and as I've said, right now there is significant support in place for people through Christmas with their energy bills.
That completes Prime Minister's questions. Just let the House clear.
Well, that is the end of Prime Minister's questions. The nurses' strikes and the various strikes that are affecting the country, a large thrust of many of the questions there. Just before we bring you analysis of what happened there with our political editor, Beth Rigby, let's just bring you the latest from what's happened out in the English Channel. It has now been confirmed that 4 people have died after a migrant boat capsized in the English Channel, a small boat that got into difficulty crossing the Channel. 43 people, though, rescued by Border Force and RNLI. Well, let's bring in our political editor, Beth Rigby, to reflect on what did happen there during Prime Minister's questions. All of the parties referred to what's happened this morning in the Channel. It's obviously been a big news story, but very quickly turned on to the wider implications of the strikes that are affecting the whole country.
Yeah, and it's difficult territory, this, for Rishi Sunak, for the Prime Minister. I mean, Keir Starmer opening up on the nurses' strike, actually not talking about all the other strikes going on, but particularly on the nurses' decision to strike tomorrow. And he said, why won't he open the door and discuss pay?
OK,
and we'll go to the Commons.
We'll go to Kurt in because Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, is making a statement about what happened.
To make a statement about an incident in the Channel this morning. This is an ongoing search and rescue incident, but I can confirm that at the time of making this statement, tragically, there have been 4 fatalities. It would be inappropriate, Mr. Speaker, for me to go into further detail at this time. There is a multi-agency response to this terrible tragedy. His Majesty's Coast Guard, the RNLI, South East Coast Ambulance, the Ministry of Defence, Police and Border Force, together with French vessels and commercial fishing vessels and contractors at Western Jetfall, have responded. This morning, Mr. Speaker, I have spoken to Border Force officials based at Dover, Manston, and involved in the search and rescue effort. I've also spoken to my French counterpart, the Interior Minister, Gérald Darmanin. A full statement will be provided to the House in due course once the facts have been fully established and the necessary investigative work completed. I know that everyone in this House and across the country will join me in expressing our profound sadness and deepest sympathies for everyone affected by this terrible event. I know that they will also join me in offering our profound gratitude to those working on the search and rescue operation. Yeah. That very much includes those who are responding to the incident. Commander Dan O'Mahony and his team are working tirelessly with military colleagues and other partners, day in and day out, to try to prevent this type of tragedy. They are undertaking immensely difficult work, and we should all be extremely grateful to them. Mr. Speaker, these are the days that we dread. Crossing the Channel in unseaworthy vessels is a lethally dangerous endeavour. It is for this reason, above all, that we are working so hard to destroy the business model of the people smugglers, evil, organised criminals who treat human beings as cargo. As the Prime Minister told the House only yesterday, it is not cruel or unkind to want to break the stranglehold of the criminal gangs who trade in human misery and who exploit our system and our laws. He was right. This morning's tragedy, like the loss of 27 people on 1 November day last year, is the most sobering reminder possible of why we have to end these crossings. We recently agreed the largest ever small boats deal with France, with more boots on the ground patrolling their beaches, UK and French officers working together in both countries. The Calais Group of Northern European nations works to disrupt trafficking and smuggling all along the migration route and has set an ambition for a UK-EU-wide agreement on migration. And since 2015, we have welcomed 450,000 people here from all across the world via safe and legal routes, making these dangerous crossings totally unnecessary. But it was evident that we had to go much further, which is why the Prime Minister announced a new package yesterday. It includes a new, permanent, unified small boats operational command, bringing together the military, civilian capabilities, and the National Crime Agency. It will coordinate intelligence, interception, processing, and enforcement using advanced technology, including drones. We are adding more than 700 new staff and doubling the funding for the NCA to tackle organised immigration crime in Europe. The Prime Minister announced yesterday a new agreement with Albania. For the first time, Border Force officers will be embedded in Tirana Airport, helping to disrupt organised crime groups and people smugglers, risking people's lives unnecessarily. And early next year, we will introduce new legislation to make it unambiguously clear that if someone comes to the UK illegally, they should not be able to remain here. Instead, they can expect to be detained and swiftly returned either to their home country or to a safe country where their claim for asylum will be considered. Late or spurious claims and appeals will not be possible, and once someone has been removed, they will have no right to re-entry, settlement, or citizenship. This will act as a deterrent, and it will save lives. As we grip illegal migration, we will create more safe and legal routes, working with the UNHCR to identify those most in need and introducing an annual quota set by Parliament. We will work closely with local authorities to determine capacity. Mr. Speaker, it isn't true that our capacity is limitless. We are already spending millions on hotels every day. People do not need to seek asylum if they are already in a safe country. It is vital, literally vital, that we end the illegal crossings in the Channel, and I commend the statement to the House.
Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Home Secretary for advance sight of her statement. This is truly tragic, deeply distressing news, and all of our thoughts and prayers will be with those who have lost their lives and their families and friends who have lost loved ones in the icy waters of the Channel. We will be thinking too of those who will be receiving support and medical assistance who may have been rescued as well. And all of us will give our thanks to the brave responders and rescuers in the Border Force, in the RNLI, in the Coast Guard, in the MOD, in our emergency services and in the French authorities, responding not just today to this awful, awful tragedy, but also who do such heroic work every single day. It is only because of their brave work that more lives have not been lost. It was barely more than a year ago that 27 lives were lost when a boat went down. And all of us have warned, all of us have feared that it was just a matter of time before more lives were lost. It is, of course, why the UK and France both need to act to stop these dangerous boat crossings. The brutal truth as well is that criminal gangs have made money from those lives that were lost today. They have profited as people have drowned. Day after day, week after week, criminal gangs are putting lives at risk for money. And the other brutal truth is that far from stopping those criminal gangs, those gangs have grown and grown. And the UK and French governments and authorities have failed to stop the criminal and smuggler and trafficking gangs proliferating around the Channel. Those gangs have created a multi-million-pound criminal industry with lives at stake, and the action against those gangs has been too weak. There have been barely any prosecutions or convictions and barely any inroads into the smuggler gangs. Just 3 convictions for people smuggling a month at a time when tens of thousands of lives are being put at risk each month. It is why we have long called for a long time for a major boost to the National Crime Agency, because we do need major action. And yesterday, the Prime Minister announced an increase for the National Crime Agency. I am glad that he has made some progress on this, but can the Home Secretary clarify what does it mean in practice? How much additional funding will there be in practice for the National Crime Agency? How much, and specifically for the action on the smuggler gangs? How many additional full-time staff will there be? And what is the sense of scale on this? Because I fear still that this is too low and this is too little given the scale of the problem we face. Yesterday, the Prime Minister announced a small boat operational command. Again, how different is that to the previous clandestine Channel Threat Command, led by Commander Dan Omani, which has been in operation for some time? Will it still be led by Commander Dan Omani or by somebody else? Will it be the Home Office or the MOD in charge? Is it correct that the Navy has been told they will be standing down on the 31st of January? Can she update us too on the French patrols and surveillance? Has the 40% promised increase in patrols started yet, and when will it? Was this boat picked up as a result of increased surveillance? If it wasn't, what was the reason for that? The Home Secretary has also referred to safe legal routes. She was pressed at the Select Committee on a lack of safe legal routes for children trying to unite with family in the UK. When will she be taking action to address that, to prevent children seeking to rejoin family in the UK, making desperate journeys? And she referred to the Prime Minister's statement yesterday. Can she clarify? We have also called for the fast track for safe countries and for the backlog to be cleared. The Prime Minister said he had set a personal target of 117,000 cases to be cleared by the end of next year. Number 10 later said that target was 92,000. Could she again confirm which of those it is? The responsibility for the lives that have been lost in the Channel lies with the criminal gangs. They need to be caught, they need to be prosecuted, they need to be jailed for the loss of life in the cold sea, and we need comprehensive action. We gathered in this House just over a year ago to lament the loss of 27 lives. None of us want to do so again. None of us want to be here again. That's where we need action before more lives are lost in peril on the sea.
Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, today is a day to demonstrate our sympathy for the victims and the families of this deadly and tragic incident. It is a day to express gratitude to our hard-working emergency services, border force and search and rescue and MOD colleagues who at this moment are conducting an operation in the Channel in very difficult and challenging circumstances. the Right Honourable Laney mentions a few points, and I want to respond to some of those in detail. The Small Boats Operational Command is going to be a new operational command that the Prime Minister announced yesterday as part of our plan to go further on the action that we will take to stop the boats crossing the Channel. This means that we are setting up a new HQ, the Small Boats Operational Command in Border Force, to bring our channel and processing operation under a single Home Office command with military support for specialist planning and operational advice. As part of this, we will bring in new air and maritime capabilities, including new drones, land-based radar, fixed-wing aircraft, and more. And we will be more than doubling our current permanent staffing levels, with 100 new staff at HQ and over 600 new operational staff based at Dover. That's a sign that we are strengthening our resolve, we are strengthening our will, and we are strengthening our efforts to do whatever it takes, as the Prime Minister has pledged, to stop the boats crossing the Channel. It will improve our intelligence and information sharing with the French. It will improve and build on the cooperation that we have with partners in France. The deal that we signed last month with colleagues in France is a big step forward in our cross-channel cooperation, for we share a common challenge. And that new arrangement will see more dangerous and unnecessary crossings being prevented. Last year, our joint efforts prevented over 23,000 unnecessary journeys. To date, this year, that number is 31,000. That in itself is insufficient, but it's a step in the right direction, and the agreement that we have struck afresh with the French will go further to enhance our joint working. She mentions safe and legal routes. Since 2015, we have made it possible for 450,000 people to come here via safe and legal routes. That's a record of which I am immensely proud. Those are people who have come from countries like Ukraine, from Syria, from Afghanistan. They're people who have come from all over the world, directly from places of danger, including via the UK resettlement scheme, where people have been selected by the UN refugee agencies from countries including Ethiopia, Iraq, Sudan, Eritrea, Somalia, South Sudan, and Yemen. And so we will extend safe and legal routes once we have dealt with the appalling people smuggling gangs risking people's lives, as we have seen this morning. And lastly, she talks about our track record on this issue. This government won't stop until we have seen progress, until people understand that taking this lethal journey is not safe, it is not lawful, and it will not lead them to a better life in the United Kingdom. Our capacity, that there are millions of people around the world who are fleeing conflict and poverty and who seek a better life elsewhere. Our capacity in this country is not infinite. We cannot accept everybody who wishes to come to this country. That is a reality of the world, and it's a reality of life. The other party would suggest otherwise. I hope that she will join us in our strengthened resolve to stop this problem by supporting our measures and supporting our legislation next year.
Jim Lawson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I echo the sympathies of the Home Secretary and the tributes to the rescue services. And frankly, it is a miracle that no lives have been lost in British territorial waters before now. And that's a tribute to the professionalism of Border Force, of the RNLI and Coast Guard and others. And being no doubt, the blood is on the hands of the criminal gangs responsible for this tragedy. Of course, the best thing would be for those boats not to leave the shore in the first place. So can she update the House about any progress she may be having in discussions with her French counterparts, which will persuade them either to intercept those boats if they get into the water and bring the passengers back to French land from where they started, or when they do intercept people on the beaches about to get into the boats, that they are arrested and detained rather than set free and allowed to try again the following night. That is the only thing that is really going to stop this immediately, as we need it to happen.
Well, my right honourable friend is right, and I'm very proud of the new agreement that we have struck with our French colleagues in this regard, and already there has been progress. In the last few weeks, there have been initial deployments of embedded officers under the deal, with the first full deployments before Christmas. The joint headquarters function is up and running with regular operational planning meetings between the UK and French law enforcement and intelligence agencies, and we are working together with French partners to achieve the Calais Group agreements that we struck last week to deepen our intelligence cooperation with near neighbours.
Alison Thewlis. Here. Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I first want to thank and pay tribute to my honourable friend from Cumbernauld, Kilsyth and Kirkintilloch East, who so ably fulfilled this role before me. Here. Madam Deputy Speaker, I and my SNP colleagues send our condolences, our sincerest condolences, to the families and friends of those 4 reported to have died in the early hours of this morning, and hope it will be possible for those rescued to make a full recovery. And we give thanks to all involved in rescue efforts in such perishingly cold conditions and those still out searching in the Channel. Madam Deputy Speaker, we want to end these crossings. Everybody does. The reality is...
Well, let's bring in our political correspondent, Amanda Akas, who joins us now in the studio. Amanda, we heard that statement there from the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman. Anything particularly new, given that we had this extensive statement from the Prime Minister yesterday?
Well, I think a lot of what she said was reiterating that series of announcements, particularly this focus on this new Small Boats Command, bringing everything under one roof, really, in the Home Office, with these additional 700 people being employed to work on that. She did also say that she'd spoken to her French counterpart about the incident, confirmed, of course, the tragic news that there are now 4 confirmed deaths, and said that investigation was going underway, and she would update everyone once they know more. She said that this was a sobering reminder of why the crossings have to end, but also tried to talk up what the government, particularly the new administration under Rishi Sunak, have been doing in terms of this recent deal with France have been struck in terms of putting more boots on the ground and having joint border force officials working together, French and UK, in one place, but also acknowledging that we needed to go a lot further. I think that then opened the door, I think, to Yvette Cooper very much with her response in terms of arguing that it was not much that was new there.
Amanda, thanks so much. We're going to take a short break. You are watching Sky News. Coming up in the next hour, the very latest from both sides of the Channel as 4 people die and more than 40 are rescued after a boat carrying migrants gets into difficulty.